Chapter 15:16. Seeing the changes in the sky ceiling formation after Saint Tiankai extracted all the fragments of the Great Path, Luo Fan could clearly see the relief in their eyes, even though the fake sage's expressions did not change. Previously, the existence of the heaven ceiling formation had brought a lot of pressure to the many false saints. After all, if any of them encountered the sky ceiling formation alone, they would not be able to resist it unless they had the determination to drag the entire universe down with them. In other words, it was impossible for them to defeat the heaven ceiling sage. Although this wasn't enough to make them feel jealous of Saint Sky Sealer, nor was it enough to make them join forces to kill Saint Sky Sealer, it was still a form of pressure for them. However, things are different now. After losing so many great Tao fragments, the power of the sky ceiling formation had weakened so much that it seemed to be similar to a true sage's mystique. It might even be weaker than an ordinary true sage's mystique. To them, their strength had naturally fallen to their level. The pressure caused by their strength being overpowered naturally disappeared without a trace. This change in mentality was no secret to any of the newcomers present. It was the same for the heaven ceiling sage. Therefore, he felt even more heartbroken at this moment. How about we place the Tao containing void in this world? Hun Guzi was no longer in the mood to care about the heaven ceiling sage. He directly said to Luo Fan and the other false sages. Hearing this, everyone naturally nodded in agreement. It could only be placed in this world that had been modified by a true sage. However, only a world that had an extremely strong ability to restrict false sages could make all the false sages feel at ease. Otherwise, if it was placed on a sage, and that sage had any bad thoughts, he could directly shatter the Tao containing void, which was also the black ball that contained the great Tao fragments, and directly integrate all the great Tao fragments into his body. Who could stop him then? Wouldn't things be irreversible? As for placing in this world, it would be even easier to place the great Tao fragments when the time came. For the false sages, they could build a void passage that was directly connected to this place. That couldn't be any easier. There would be no difficulty at all. Moreover, there was another advantage to placing it here. That was, in the future, they would be able to directly transform this part of the world into what they ultimately wanted, the world formed by the great Tao fragments contained within almost all the pseudo-primordial origin spirit treasures. Anyway, when the time comes, the world itself was no longer of any use. Turning it into the foundation of the world and obtaining the profound mysteries of a true saint's modification was the best choice. Since it had been decided, the next step was naturally to prepare. After all, even though the Tao containment void was placed in this world, it didn't mean that it could be placed here without any defense. Instead, it still required a certain level of defense, and the black ball had to be placed in a specific location. This time, many false sages from the same camp as Luo Fan attacked at the same time. Each of them emitted rays of true sage-level spiritual light that wrapped around the black ball, wrapping around it and slowly sinking it into the void, allowing it to pass through the law layer, penetrate the void layer, and directly sink into the unseen world, directly appearing on the great path. At this point, the black ball still did not stop. Or rather, the many false sages did not stop. Instead, they continued to push the ball, slowly sinking it into the great path. This meant that the place where their camp had imprinted their mark back then was gradually fusing with the great path, becoming inseparable from then on. At the very least, it was already impossible for the other false sages to separate them. Unless there were so many false sages and the same false sages attacking at the same time, they would only be able to separate them. This powerful defense was an extremely perfect defense. It was enough to make it so that no other sages could do anything to the Tao containment void before they pulled it out. After doing all this, Hun Guzi and the others, as well as Luo Fan, bowed to the many false sages who originally belonged to the other two camps. Then they turned around and stepped out of this world. The moment they stepped out of this world, the world shook slightly. There seemed to be some kind of inexplicable wave sweeping through the unseen great Tao. After that, They were allowed to leave this world without stopping them at all. When everyone left, Saint Heaven Sealer had already started to fuse the sky sealing formation into his body. The sky sealing formation was much weaker than before the Great Tao fragment was extracted. However, it was still a true sage-level formation after all. No matter how weak it was still limited. Under such circumstances, it was not an easy task to truly integrate the entire formation into his body. At this moment, Saint Heaven Sealer had completely forgotten about everything in the outside world. He was completely focused on the sky sealing formation in front of him. He slowly swallowed it into his body through his palm, slowly merging it with his body's origin and slowly changing his origin. This process was actually similar to the process of Luo Fan completely refining and fusing the divine court heaven cauldron into his body. In essence, it was also a process of changing the essence of his body. If it wasn't for the fact that Saint Heaven Sealer was born because of the formation of the sky sealing formation, it might have taken as long as Luo Fan's. How could it be like this, where the changes were visible to the naked eye to complete the process? Just as Saint Heaven Sealer began to fuse with the sky sealing formation, the aura of heaven and earth contained within his body began to slowly spread out from his body. As the aura of heaven and earth spread out, an indescribable pressure began to spread out from Saint Heaven Sealer's body, gradually forming an indescribable pressure on this world. As this situation appeared, the special mechanism that was originally given to this world by Luo Fan and the others was instantly activated. The entire world began to change rapidly. Time became more stable, space became more stable, and the law layer became more complicated. The great Tao in the unseen world grew rapidly. In just a short while, it had grown to a point where it was almost twice as strong as before. At this moment, continents began to be born in this world one after another. The starry sky and the sky also appeared one after another, stacking up one after another, making the already indescribably complex starry sky even more complicated. When all the changes subsided, the number of continents in this world had already increased by exactly 300. It just so happened to match the number of false saints who had set up the sky sealing formation. However, compared to the many continents that originally existed in this world, these 300 continents were all several times smaller. However, they were all several times smaller, making them look a little pocket-sized. The total number was probably only equivalent to half of the original area of all the continents. They even called it an archipelago. Instead, it was more appropriate. The many false saints in this world saw this fact. Shock appeared on their faces. However, none of them expected that when Saint Heaven Sealer entered this world, he didn't cause any changes in this world. The evolution became even more vast. Instead, the great Tao fragments of the sky sealing formation appeared when they were extracted. However, they were all false saints after all, but they were all people with extraordinary thinking. Soon, they had already figured out what was going on. Previously, although the Heaven Sealing Sage was a false sage and the power of his mystical ability was much stronger than ordinary false sages, the Heaven Sealing Sage was a false sage. However, the foundation was still based on the sky sealing formation. It was more like the essence of a unified consciousness. It was an existence that was between a formation spirit and a real life. Since that was the case, the many worlds that were swallowed into his body were naturally covered by his existence. The pressure he exerted on the outside world was naturally restricted in his body and wouldn't affect the outside world at all. And this brought about a result. No matter which world he entered, he wouldn't make the world feel pressured. His existence wouldn't cause the world to collapse because of his existence. In this world, it was obviously one of the other worlds, and there would be no exception. However, the situation was different at this time. At this time, he gradually fused with the sky sealing formation. His essence began to transcend the formation spirit and gradually become real. In addition to the stimulation of the aura of the world in his body, this result was caused. The pressure from the world in his body began to break through his body and descend into this world. If it was in other worlds, such a change would be enough to completely destroy the world and never exist again. But here, in front of him, this was only a change that was seen in the eyes of the many false saints in this world. I didn't expect that there would be such a change when the world enters here. Jing Yitzi looked at the newly born continents and couldn't help but mutter to himself. Similar to him, the other false saints were also paying attention to these newly born continents at this time. Facing these continents, all sorts of inexplicable expressions appeared on their faces. There was no other reason than that these continents were different from the continents that were born because of them. These continents didn't evolve from a state without any vitality. On the contrary, as soon as they appeared, they were already extremely prosperous and full of vitality. When the continents appeared, all sorts of living beings and civilizations had already been formed. In fact, there were even many cultivators of different strengths. How could this completely different change not attract the attention of the false saints who had a strong desire to explore? To the false saints, apart from things and powers related to the true saint, nothing else could escape their perception. Therefore, very soon, almost all the false saints knew what was going on. This is a projection, Jing Yitzi muttered, but his eyes lit up slightly. Those who had similar attitudes as Jing Yitzi were those who had been defeated, such as the false saints like Jing Yitzi. Perhaps we can make this world even more exciting. Jing Yitzi laughed heartily. As he smiled, his heart skipped a beat. In an instant, the pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasure that he had integrated with the great Tao fragments began to evolve into a vast, boundless, and even more lively world. The flow of time in those worlds was accelerated to the limit that Jing Yitzi could control. Almost in an instant, it was equivalent to millions of years. In a few breaths, hundreds of millions of years had passed. Very soon, more and more powerful cultivators began to appear in those worlds. Khanate, zenith heaven, quasi-saints, false saints, and even supreme supremacies. However, these false saints and supreme supremacies were unable to break through to become false saints because of the shackles of the world. In the end, they could only linger around the supreme supremacy level. They were constantly looking for a way out. After a while, when the cultivation civilization in the world inside the pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasure evolved to its limit, Jing Yitzi's heart skipped a beat. The aura of the pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasure began to be released without reservation. A boundless and terrifying pressure was directly emitted from his body. It began to suppress the world. It began to suppress the great Tao of this world. It began to suppress the nomological layer. With this change, the world began to change, just like what happened when the heaven-sealing sage's aura of the world appeared. Below him, the continent that was born because of him suddenly collapsed. Then, it began to condense again in an instant, directly forming a continent that was completely different from the original barren appearance. It was a continent full of vitality. Once it was formed, there would already be countless living beings, an extremely prosperous cultivation civilization, and an unknown number of cultivators. In this continent, there were even quite a number of supreme supremacies. It can indeed be done. Then let me see what changes will happen when the time comes. Jing Yitzi's eyes flashed with great anticipation, even excitement. This kind of light was similar to the time when he went to see the heaven-sealing formation, his true divine theurgy, the other false sage's true divine theurgy, and Luo Fan's karma web during the war between the four countries. It also had the same feeling of wanting the world to be in chaos. As Jing Yitzi began to take action, many of the false sages who were trapped in this world because of their defeat also took similar actions. The continent beneath their feet also crumbled and reformed before completely changing its appearance. Among them, Jing Yitzi's change was the greatest, even greater than the continent under Jing Yitzi's feet. Although an extremely prosperous cultivation civilization was born on Jing Yitzi's continent, it was still a cultivation civilization after all. Although there were supreme supremacies, there were not many of them. On the other hand, the continent under Jing Yitzi's feet was different. The cultivation civilization on that continent was not as prosperous as Jing Yizi's cultivation civilization, but the number of supreme supremacies was far more than the continent under Jing Yizi's feet by tens or even hundreds of times. It could almost be said that there were level 9 pseudo-sages everywhere, and supreme supremacies were like dogs. Compared to the anticipation and excitement in Jing Yizi's eyes, there was only a kind of naked malice in Jing Yizi's eyes. After the continent under his feet took shape, his incarnation directly stepped into the continent and began to preach, explaining to the living beings on the continent about the method to prove one's Tao and become a sage. Although the continent was only 1/100th of the entire world, its size was also boundless. However, its size was similarly boundless. It could only be measured in light years to clearly measure its size. In such a vast area, in addition to the stability of time and space, even supreme venerables and level 9 pseudo-saints would be greatly suppressed in this world. Naturally, they would not be able to spread their senses across the entire world in a split second in other worlds. Therefore, the cultivators on these continents rarely knew that the continent they were on was only one of the hundreds of continents in this world. To most cultivators, the world they were in was only their continent. Their continent was their world. This was true even for many supreme supremacies and level 9 pseudo-sages. When Jing Yizi began to preach the method to prove one's Tao and become a sage on this continent as a pseudo-sage, the entire world instantly changed for the living beings on this continent. It was as if a supreme sage had suddenly descended to the mortal world to guide them forward. For a time, there were all sorts of piety, all sorts of fanaticism. Among the remaining 70 to 80 pseudo-sages in this world, more than 20 of them were like Jing Yizi. They used their own methods to change the continent under their feet, causing it to instantly turn from a barren land to full of vitality. Countless cultivators were suddenly born from it, although they all put in effort to nurture the cultivators on the continent. Not many of them were like Jing Yizi, who directly went to open altars. They only used all sorts of indirect methods, such as leaving various methods somewhere, or setting up all sorts of secret realms for the cultivators to comprehend on their own. In order to give the cultivators on the continent more time to grow, after Jing Yizi entered the continent, he began to accelerate the flow of time on this continent. This caused hundreds of millions of years to pass in just a few dozen breaths of time in the outside world. Finally, at a certain moment, a strange fluctuation appeared on the continent that belonged to Jing Yizi. The great Tao that was hidden in the unseen world suddenly began to emit some kind of strange fluctuation. He broke through the unseen world. He broke through the layer of nothingness. He broke through the layer of laws, descended into normal space-time, and directly rushed into Jing Yizi's continent. Then, an unparalleled, eternal, and indestructible aura emitted from the continent and began to engulf the entire world. It's really done. A pseudo-sage looked at Jing Yizi's continent with a faint smile on his face. His expression seemed to be gloating, but it also seemed to be a little worried. Right at this moment, a figure slowly walked out from the heaven and earth. He was Jing Yizi. At this moment, he had a gloating expression on his face. He was not worried at all. He was different from the other pseudo-sages. After leaving that continent, Jing Yizi returned to the void and came to a golden building complex that looked like a Buddhist country. He directly entered it and did something unknown. At this moment, the eternal, indestructible, and indestructible aura of the continent that belonged to the sages, or rather, the false sages, became more and more intense. It became more and more obvious. After the fluctuation emitted by the great Tao entered the continent, it combined with something unknown, causing countless rays of light and heavenly flowers to appear in the sky, causing the sound of the great Tao to continuously spread out. An incomparably sacred aura and a supreme and noble aura continuously spread out from the aura that belonged to the false sage. It's finally done. A voice that seemed very young, but also very old, came from the continent. The many false sages were all experienced people, but they could clearly hear the ease of finally achieving something after cultivating for billions of trillion years. They knew that this was the most relaxed and carefree sigh a cultivator could make after becoming a false sage. For a moment, an inexplicable nostalgia appeared on the faces of the many false sages. They had also experienced this before. However, it was only later that they realized how fragile this kind of ease and carefreeness was. Only then did they understand that after reaching this step, the most difficult juncture in their cultivation was placed in front of them, waiting for them to conquer it. Another person has stepped into the sea of suffering. One of the false sages sighed at this moment. These words resonated with many false sages, which was rare. That young and old voice only said that sentence before it stopped abruptly. Then a figure walked out from the continent and stood in the void. As he looked around, he let out a cry of disbelief. How is this possible? However, as a false saint, he instantly saw the many false saints who were in various postures and appearances in the void above the world at this moment. The complacency brought about by becoming a false sage completely disappeared in an instant. It was replaced by the unbelievable thought that he was dreaming. Come! Golden Zen Master's voice sounded out of thin air and entered the figure's ears. This figure was a man who looked like a young man. He looked like he was only 13 or 14 years old. If he were to be placed in the mortal world, he would almost be considered a Shoda. When he heard Golden Zen Master's words, a look of disbelief flashed in his eyes, followed by an inexplicable joy. He hurriedly took a step forward and entered the building complex that Golden Zen Master had created, going to meet Golden Zen Master. Chapter 15:17. Looking at the young man's appearance, it was obvious that the reason he could prove his Tao and become a false saint of this world was closely related to Golden Zen Master. It was even very likely that Golden Zen Master had guided him to this step by step. As this newly born false saint that completely belonged to this world entered the building where Golden Zen Master was, the others naturally couldn't continue paying attention to it. Of course, they didn't have the time to continue paying attention. That was because another living being that belonged to this world had proven his Tao and become a false saint. The phenomenon that had occurred when the young man had proven his Tao and become a false saint appeared in this world once again. The continent where a false saint became a true saint was still the continent under Golden Zen Master's feet. The flow of time in that continent had been adjusted by Golden Zen Master to be billions of times faster than the outside world. Although only a short while had passed since the young man became a false saint in the outside world, trillions of years had passed in that continent. In addition, this continent had the inheritance that Golden Zen Master had imparted from a true saint to become a false saint. At this time, it was extremely normal for other cultivators to become false saints again. Looks like he's quite resentful, Jing Yitzi thought to himself when he saw all of this. The great Tao of this world was not the true great Tao, but a projection of the great Tao. Don't forget that when Jing Yitzi and Luo Fan opened up this world together, they didn't integrate the true great Tao fragments into it. What became the great Tao of this world was just a projection of the great Tao fragments. As a result, the final great Tao was naturally just a projection of the great Tao, even though it was modified by a true saint later on, because the true saint didn't really set the goal of the modification on this. The characteristics of this great Tao were not changed. Such a great Tao. For real living beings, it was almost impossible to prove their Tao and become a true saint here. In fact, there would probably be quite a big problem just cultivating, let alone becoming a true saint. It was precisely because of this limitation that, all along, before they discovered how to project the living beings in the world inside the primordial spiritual treasure, all the false saints couldn't make the living beings on their continents become false saints even if they wanted to. However, when they were able to project the living beings within the primordial origin spirit treasure, the situation would be different. These projected paths were illusory existences to real living beings. They were not enough for them to cultivate, nor were they enough for them to become saints. But to this projected living being, naturally, it will be completely different. To the projection, the great Tao was the true Great Tao. To them, it was the same as the true Grand Tao to Jing Yitzi. That was why there was such a situation where those living beings that were projected could actually verify their Tao and become false sages in this world. And the appearance of these false sages. However, it wasn't something that Jin Shanzi or Jing Yitzi had deliberately nurtured out of boredom. The appearance of these false saints would have a huge impact on this world. False saints were powerful existences born from the Great Tao. This kind of existence, it was completely linked to the fate of the Great Tao of this world. If the Great Tao grew, they would also grow. If the Great Tao was damaged, they would also be damaged. As a result, it was impossible for them to accept that the nature of this world would change completely in the future. It was impossible for them to accept that this world would eventually fuse into a huge world formed by the fusion of many true Great Tao fragments. And with their abilities, although they were only false saints, the power that they could unleash in this world was unimaginably strong. Even true sage mystical abilities couldn't destroy them. Just like how many false saints could still be revived from the Great Tao after being destroyed by a true sage mystical abilities. These false saints that were born from this world, they also had the same ability. In this way, the appearance of these false saints. Obviously, this would become an obstacle for Luo Fan, Hun Guzi, and Luo Fan in constructing this world. It would make it impossible for them to choose this world as the foundation of their world. They would have to open up another world, and they would have to redesign and construct another world. This was the trouble that Jing Yitzi and Jin Shanzi wanted to create for Hun Guzi and the others, making the world appear and fusing the many pseudo-primordial origin spirit treasures was the general trend. Ever since Jin Shanzi and the others failed, it could no longer be resisted. Therefore, this was the only trouble they could create for Hun Guzi and the others now. From a certain point of view, this was obviously an indescribable sense of helplessness. In the next few days, there would be a false saint who succeeded in proving their Tao every few days. They left the continent they were on and appeared in this world. Among them, not all false saints were born from the continent under Jin Shanzi's feet. On the other continents, false sages were also being born one after another. Among them, the continent that Jing Yitzi was on had more than 30 false saints, which was second only to the number of Jin Shanzi's over 50. This should be enough. If there are more, I'm afraid there will be some trouble. Jing Yitzi smiled and waved his hand. The flow of time in the continent under his feet slowed down rapidly. In the blink of an eye, it had completely returned to the normal flow of time that was the same as the outside world. At this moment, the number of false saints born in this world was already close to 200. However, compared to the number of false saints under the saints here, it was already more than double the number of false saints under the saints. Now, the disciples under the saints were even more powerful and could suppress them. However, if the number of false saints increased, they would become even more powerful. In the end, they would turn the tables and suppress them. By then, they would go for wool and come home shorn. The other false saints clearly saw this as well. At this moment, even Golden Zen Master had restored the flow of time in the continents under his feet to the same level as the outside world. He stopped the trend of false saints being born in their respective continents that were constantly erupting like a fountain. After a few days of development, many false saints had hidden themselves at the highest point of this world. However, they were no longer as careless as before, settling down in midair without any disguise. This was not because they wanted to maintain a sense of mystery, but because there were more and more false saints being born in this world. When each false saint was born, they would naturally spread out all kinds of senses. This made them feel a little annoyed. At the highest point of this world, the surroundings were hazy. However, it was a strange state that was in between the hazy, chaotic state and the normal world. Surviving in such a state made many pseudo-sages feel as if they had returned to their own world, but made them feel even more comfortable. Below this, the many false saints were above the void and in the void below them. They opened up one world after another, or rather, they created Taoist rites. They were so densely packed that they looked like suns hanging in the sky. They showed their existence to the entire world. Before those projection cultivators became false saints, because of the complexity of the laws of this world, the vastness of the great Tao, the stability of space, and the stability of time, the power of their mystical abilities would be greatly limited. Even level, 9 false saints and supreme venerables would find it difficult to transcend the continents they were in. Their ability to open up a world would be extremely limited, becoming many times more powerful than normal level. 9 false saints and supreme venerables. It might even be difficult to open up a major kiliacosm. However, after they verified their Tao and became false sages, then the situation would be completely different. After they became false saints, they would almost become the representatives of the great Tao, regardless of whether the great Tao was strong or weak. They would be able to control and use it, but they would no longer be restricted by the state of the world. Under such circumstances, no matter what kind of world they wanted to open up, as long as the world could withstand it, it would be as simple as a thought. Just like at this moment, the dojos below, the many sages had surpassed the major kiliacosm and could even be compared to those worlds that could give birth to sages. One by one, vast and boundless, majestic and unfathomable. Although, because it was still a short time, the evolution of those worlds had yet to truly unfold. At this moment, it still seemed a little monotonous, and there were not many worlds like major kiliacosm being born in them. However, that was obviously only temporary. As time passed, those dojos would naturally evolve into many worlds. Naturally, endless worlds would be born. This was where the deep rules of the Earth universe were. Just like the endless major kiliacosm that existed in the void at this moment, and even the worlds that could give birth to sages, weren't they also evolved from the Earth universe itself? Just as all sorts of changes occurred in this world, and so many false saints were born outside this world, in the various worlds, Luo Fan, Hanuzi, and the others had already started to find worlds that could give birth to false saints. They used all sorts of methods to seize those pseudo-primal origin spiritual treasures. There were a total of 43 of them, and each of them had the strength to suppress all other false saints without true saint abilities. Therefore, it was naturally impossible for them to gather together and sweep through the various worlds as a team. Instead, they split into 43 teams, and each of them formed an independent team. They spread out and headed towards the depths of the various worlds, heading towards the worlds that could give birth to false saints. At this moment, Luo Fan was also in charge of direction. In the various worlds, there were thousands of pseudo-saints who had pseudo-primal origin spiritual treasures that could break free from the shackles of heaven and earth. After deducting the disciples of sages like Hanuzi, there were still countless of them. The many false saints were distributed in a total of 700 to 800 worlds. If they were to be converted, each of Luo Fan and the others would need to walk more than 20 worlds to collect all the pseudo-primal origin spiritual treasures that they knew. Of course, because they still needed thousands of false saints as sacrifices, their collection process was not warm at all. Instead, it seemed rather bloody. Not only did they have to obtain the pseudo-primal origin spiritual treasures, but they also had to capture those false saints. At this moment, Luo Fan had already arrived outside a world. This part of the world was like a mirror. It floated in the void, and around it were densely packed, boundless worlds. At first glance, it looked like a cloud of smoke. Around the mirror-like world, there were 33 pseudo-primal origin spiritual treasures that emitted a strong, eternal, and indestructible aura. "You're finally here," a helpless voice came from the mirror. Following this sentence, the magnificent figures of the 33 false saints appeared on the mirror. There were men and women, old and young, and they seemed to contain all kinds of human beings among them. The one who had spoken was an extremely old man. The position of this old man was in the middle of the 33 pseudo-saints. The other pseudo-saints seemed to be surrounding and protecting this pseudo-saint. "I'm sorry. There are some things, although they are not what I want. What do you, existences who have grasped the true saint mystical ability, want to do?" the false saint asked. Existences like you who have grasped the true sage mystiques. What exactly do you guys want to do? The fake sage asked. We want to create a world that can allow all false saints to become real. Luo Fan did not hide anything and directly revealed Hunguzi and the others' thoughts, although he did not believe that it would succeed. Is that so? It seems like it's similar to the decision of the false saint meeting back then. However, I remember that you didn't approve of it back then, right? Why are you so proactive now? The false saint asked. Almost all the surviving false saints had participated in the false saint meeting back then. The false saints in this world were obviously not an exception, obviously, to the false saints. Even if there were billions of people gathered together, they would still be able to clearly distinguish what any one of them had done, and they would be able to remember it clearly. Under such circumstances, there were only a few thousand people, so they could naturally distinguish what Luo Fan had said, what they had done, and what choices they had. It was really normal for him to say such words at this moment. Upon hearing this, Luo Fan was not surprised and said indifferently, "That was then, and this is now. Back then, I wasn't strong enough, so I naturally chose the choice that could preserve my strength. Now that I'm strong enough, I don't need to suppress myself anymore." When the false saint heard this, he sighed and said, "It seems like there's no other way. Since that's the case, let's do it." Luo Fan nodded. "That's right. Originally, this kind of conversation shouldn't happen between you and me. We're all false saints, so who doesn't understand who?" These words didn't move any of the false saints. They didn't move at all. In an instant, the 33 pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures around the mirror trembled, and rays of mysterious light began to gush out from the pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures. They formed a world with countless layers in the void and directly wrapped around Luo Fan. In this world, space and time were incomparably stable. Just by looking at these two, even the great heaven and earth paled in comparison to this world. However, such a world obviously couldn't compare to the real big world. In fact, it wasn't a complete world, a complete world. In that world, there was no normal land, no normal sky, no sun, moon, and stars, let alone the balance and stability of a normal world. The entire world seemed to have gathered all the extreme attributes together, and all the changes were displayed to an unbelievable peak level. Just how terrifying were the changes that had taken place? It could be said that if an ordinary false saint were to enter it, he would be instantly wiped out, and only the essence of a saint would be left. If this false saint was unfortunate enough to absorb his source in his body, then even the essence of the saint might collapse and die, because his source was wiped out at the same time. At this moment, Luo Fan was facing such a world. Facing such a world, Luo Fan sighed. With a thought, he raised his hand and pointed. In an instant, among the many karma webs that were quietly staying in the boundless wide world in his body, one of them rushed out from his finger. In an instant, it spread out and turned into a strange light that filled the world, directly wrapping around the world. Of course, this wrapping was not simple. It was very violent. Instead, it compressed endless changes within it. In this wrapping, countless true sage-level changes were displayed. Even if the world underwent billions of changes during the process of being wrapped, it couldn't escape the wrapping of the karma webs at all. It was like an ordinary and immobile world that was directly wrapped in the karma webs. The karma webs was a true saint theurgy. When it first appeared, its power was not considered strong. It was not much different from the power of ordinary pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures. However, it was truly powerful. It contained the changes of the true saint level, and it could naturally adjust the changes and change its power according to the situation of the theurgy and magic treasures that it was fighting against. Then, it would continuously increase its power and increase its changes. At this moment, Luo Fan's karma web had already undergone an unknown number of upgrades. It had transformed into a karma web. Its power was already tens of thousands of times stronger than its original form. At this moment, as soon as it came into contact with this strange thing, it shook slightly and destroyed the entire world. The world turned back into 33 mysterious lights, and was firmly wrapped up. Seeing this, the false saints that appeared on the mirror had a slight change in their expressions. Obviously, they didn't expect the false saint in front of them to be so powerful. They didn't expect the true Saint Theurgy to be so terrifying. The world formed by the combination of the power of their 33 primordial origin spiritual treasures was a joint attack technique that all the false saints had spent trillions of years to deduce. Its power was so powerful that any of them admitted that they wouldn't be able to survive for more than 10 breaths if they entered it. Originally, they didn't expect that this world could defeat the true Saint Theurgy. However, they also thought that the true Saint Theurgy would take a long time to destroy it. However, they didn't expect that the reality in front of them would give them a huge blow. The joint attack technique that they had spent so many years to create couldn't even withstand a true Saint Theurgy for an instant. One could imagine how much of a blow this was to them. Even though they were all false saints and had superhuman willpower, they had no choice but to change their expressions. It's a very powerful world. It's a pity. It met me. If it met someone else, it might really be able to resist for a few days. Luo Fan sighed when he saw the change in the eyes of the false saints. As he spoke, he didn't stand on ceremony at all. Under his control, the karma net shook slightly, and the 33 beams of mysterious light collapsed. Then, he charged forward again and pounced toward the 33 primordial origin spiritual treasures outside the mirror. Those false sages were false sages after all, even though they had suffered a huge blow. Although they had suffered a huge blow, they quickly regained their focus. Without needing to remind each other, they activated their primordial origin spiritual treasures in the most correct way, causing the 33 Dharma treasures to instantly erupt with 33 beams of mysterious light. The 33 beams of mysterious light merged together in the void at the same time. In the blink of an eye, they formed a huge long saber. This long saber was condensed with endless brilliance. Endless colors flowed and changed. It was as if all the principles and mysteries of the universe were contained within and condensed within it. If such a long saber were to directly slash into the Earth's universe, it would probably leave an indelible wound on the Earth's universe. If it were to attack a person, the effect would only be stronger than that of the previous world, and it wouldn't be weaker than that world. This was another variation of the joint attack technique that they had researched. It was also a variation that they believed could last for a long time under the true saint's mystical ability. However, before they really fought with Luo Fan, they might still dare to have such a mentality. However, after the previous world was instantly destroyed by Luo Fan's karma net, they no longer dare to have such thoughts. In an instant, the 33 primordial origin spiritual treasures flickered with mysterious light. They continuously combined into strange-looking objects and started to bombard the karma net. No matter what the objects condensed by the power of the 33 primordial origin spiritual treasures looked like, they all had a common characteristic, which was to unleash a certain characteristic to the limit. They could unleash it to the extent that they could easily destroy a false saint. In other words, it was the result of combining and enhancing some extreme attributes that existed in the first world. Unfortunately, these things might be effective against other false saints, but they were useless against Luo Fan's karma net. Under the karma net, nothing could last longer than an instant before it was completely annihilated by the karma net and turned back into mysterious light. Then, even the mysterious light was destroyed. Chapter 15:18. Luo Fan's karma net had already completely preserved many of the mysteries that had evolved in the past few battles. It would no longer be so troublesome when facing the 33 false saints. If the false saints under the other saints did not preserve many of the mysteries that the true saint mystiques had evolved in the past few battles, they would definitely be in an even more sorry state. Perhaps at this time, they would fall into a tug-of-war and might need a few days to defeat the false saints that they were targeting. Luo Fan's thoughts raced, and a faint smile suddenly appeared on his face. However, Luo Fan only thought about these things and did not have the intention to investigate further. Under his guidance, The karma net continuously destroyed the various joint attacks that the 33 pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures had evolved. It also crushed the mysterious lights that contained incredible power that the 33 pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures had emitted. In the end, under the desperate gazes of the 33 false saints, it instantly wrapped around the 33 pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures. The 33 pseudo-primordial chaos spiritual treasures naturally wouldn't just wait for death. The moment they were wrapped up by the net of karma, they began to erupt in a frenzy. Endless mysterious light, endless power, and all sorts of incredible attacks erupted from them. In terms of this wave of eruption, the power that the 33 pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures had erupted was not inferior to the true Saint Mystiques at all. For a moment, it caused great pressure on Luo Fan's karma net. The karma net could not suppress it for a while. It was unable to completely shatter the 33 pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures and extract the great Tao fragments that he needed. However, this was only temporary. The true mystery of the true Saint Mystiques was the changes. It was the changes that surpassed the false saint stage. At this moment, although the 33 pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures could resist for a while, they could not resist the transformation characteristics of the true Saint Mystiques of the karma net. With a few changes of the true Saint Mystiques, it easily used various mysterious methods to completely shatter the resistance of the magic treasures and directly enveloped the 33 magic treasures. As the 33 magic treasures were enveloped, the faces of the 33 false saints that appeared in the mirror turned ashen. Everything in front of them, but it seemed to make them realize how weak they really were. It made them truly feel like they were meat on the chopping block. Chi chi chi. Amidst the strange, soft sounds, beneath the net of karma, the 33 pseudo-primordial essence spirit treasures loudly exploded. All of their strength turned into mysterious worlds that spread out in all directions like a cluster of worlds. In the end, they converged into a layer of smoke-like existence that surrounded the mirror-like world, making the mirror seem hazy, as if it was shrouded in a dense fog. However, this only lasted for an instant. Soon, all of the worlds created by the explosion of the pseudo-primordial essence spirit treasure began to collapse. Endless world fragments were born from these worlds, collapsing and shrinking in all directions. In the end, it disappeared without a trace, as if it had never existed in the end. Only the endless fragments of the great Tao were left in the net of karma. These grand Tao fragments were extremely profound and profound. They contained various profundities that were deep, unfathomable, and indescribably profound. Even if they were only grand Tao fragments, it was already enough to make any cultivator who sensed their existence feel that they had gained a lot. The endless grand Tao fragments seemed to be affected by some incredible rule in the net of karma, wanting to gather together. It was as if they were forming a larger and more complete whole. However, due to the power of the net of karma, although this trend existed, it was unable to reach the end. It could only struggle and tremble in the net. It looked like a fish caught in a fishing net. Seeing this, Luo Fan did not hesitate. He raised his hand and drew in the air. Endless light emitted from his hand and condensed in the air. In the blink of an eye, it formed a strange passage that only had a beginning but no end. The beginning of this passage was directly connected to the inside of the net of karma by Luo Fan. As the passage was formed, the grand Tao fragments in the net of karma seemed to be attracted by a black hole. They began to rush into the passage and flowed along the passage to an unknown place. This passage was obviously a passage that Luo Fan had specially used to connect to the so-called Tao void in the world. The structure of this passage seemed ordinary, but already contained the extremely profound Tao of false saints. Although this place was extremely far away from that world in the spatial dimension of the Earth universe, under the effect of the many Tao of false saints, this passage easily crossed the void and directly connected to the world in an extremely unbelievable way. The moment the passage was formed, a deep hole suddenly appeared in the grand Tao in the world where there were hundreds of false saints. Or rather, it was a deep whirlpool. After this whirlpool appeared, a long river formed by countless grand Tao fragments surged out from it and began to sink. It continuously rushed into the grand Tao and directly sank into the Tao void hidden within. This change was instantly sensed by all the false sages in this world. In an instant, the expressions of many false saints changed slightly. The false saints under the saints all had stern expressions on their faces. As for the false saints born in this world, their expressions were all filled with fear. The reason why the false saints under the saints were shocked was because the speed at which these grand Tao fragments appeared was too fast. It was twice as fast as they had expected. This meant that the cultivator who sent the grand Tao fragments over was many times stronger than they had expected. How could they not be awed by this? As for the false saints born in this world, they were also fearful. That was even simpler. They were ordinary false saints. Even if they were born in this world, they were just ordinary false saints who had not mastered the true saint mystiques. Under such circumstances, suddenly discovering the appearance of this passage that was beyond their imagination and even beyond their understanding, one could imagine how shocking it was for them to be unable to resist it at all. Under such circumstances, their wariness was undeniable. Obviously, it was only natural. In an instant, the thoughts of many false saints changed. However, no matter how they changed, they knew clearly that the false saint who built this passage and sent the grand Tao fragments over was probably one of the many false saints who had left this world. The most powerful existence. At this moment, Luo Fan did not care about how much stimulation the passage that he had built had brought to the many false saints in that world. At this moment, after he sent the many grand Tao fragments into that world, he casually retracted the karma net into his hand and returned it to the many major kiliocosms in his body. After that, he did not stop. He took a light step and headed towards the depths of the void at an unimaginable speed, heading towards the other world that he had originally locked onto. Originally, other than collecting the grand Tao fragments inside the pseudo-primordial spiritual treasure, their camp also had an important mission, which was to collect false saints. They had to prepare sacrifices for the final construction of the most magnificent and vast world. According to such a mission, Luo Fan should not have left at this moment. Instead, he should have grabbed the 33 false saints in this world at the same time. However, to Luo Fan, this had already exceeded the scope of his principles. This was something that he was unwilling to do. After all, Luo Fan did not believe that the final world could turn the false saints into reality. Under such circumstances, although he had joined this camp and started to work for the final formation of that world, however, it was impossible for him to devote himself to it without reservation. It was impossible for him to completely ignore his own principles. Under this principle, he felt that collecting these pseudo-primordial spiritual treasures would only cause the strength of those false saints to be damaged. It would not cause too much damage to their foundation, so there was no problem. However, he was not willing to capture the false saint as a sacrifice and send the false saint to the sacrificial altar like livestock. Therefore, at this time, he completely ignored his mission of collecting false saints. After collecting the pseudo-primordial spiritual treasures, he left directly and headed to another world for another goal. Luo Fan left so decisively that the 33 false sages in the mirror-like world had already fallen into dead silence at this moment. What should we do now? Escape? A false saint asked the other false saints. These 33 false saints were also false saints. Although they might not know that the final formation of that world required thousands of false saints as sacrifices, they could clearly feel that losing the pseudo-primordial spiritual treasures was not the end of this matter. What awaited them next would definitely be even greater misfortune. That was why someone asked them such a question just now. We can't escape. What we can do now is to regain the ability to resist, the old man who had spoken to Luo Fan previously said. To a false saint, it was an extremely simple and easy task to find any world in this universe. Under such circumstances, if they wanted to truly escape the search of the other false saints and escape, the only choice was to escape from this universe. Only then would there be a chance of escaping. However, if a world wanted to escape from the myriad of worlds, how could such a thing happen? Even if the wisdom of these 33 false saints was combined, it was impossible for them to think of such a method. This was the main reason why the old man said that they couldn't escape. All the false saints knew this very well, so none of them refuted him at this moment. Since they had already come to a consensus, the 33 false saints naturally did not hesitate at all. At that moment, all of them worked together and crazily accelerated the flow of time in this world. This extreme strengthening ultimately made the flow of time in this world reach a level that was trillions of times faster than the outside world. When the flow of time reached this level, a single breath of time in the outside world would pass trillions of years in this world. Even a saint's control of time had already reached the acme of perfection. To accelerate time to this extent, it would require 33 false saints to act at the same time. These 33 false saints did not do what the other false saints did and only temporarily changed the flow of time in that world. Once they completed what they wanted to do, the flow of time would naturally return to normal. What they did was to completely solidify the flow of time and completely change the great Tao of heaven and earth, so that the flow of time would be permanently fixed at this level. They only stopped when they reached this step. They began to do what they did to change the flow of time. That was to refine their pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures again. To these false saints, the thing that could strengthen them the most was the pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures that they had just lost. After these pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures lost their great Tao fragments, they could no longer leave this world and retain their pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures like before. However, this did not mean that these pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures were of no help to their strength. In fact, the difference between a false saint with a pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasure and a false saint without one was more than 10 times. Moreover, other than that, although these false saints did not say it clearly, they all had another thought in mind. That was when the situation was not right, and they were forced to the point of no return. However, they could learn from those false saints who could walk freely outside this world and destroy this world and divide the great Tao of heaven and earth. They could fuse with these pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures so that they could rely on these pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures and obtain the ability to retain their false saint status even if they left this world. All the false saints had such hidden thoughts. All the false saints knew that the other false saints had such thoughts, but none of them said it out loud. After all, it was an extremely risky decision to destroy their own world and divide the great Tao. If they succeeded, these false saints would naturally turn into butterflies from cocoons and break free from the shackles of this world. From then on, they would be free and unfettered in the myriad worlds. However, if they failed, the souls of these false saints would be destroyed and they would never be able to reincarnate. They would be dead. It was precisely because they clearly understood this that these pseudo-saints tacitly maintained their silence. The 33 false saints had such a secret method. In the process of refining the pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures, they would naturally change the refining method that they had almost reached perfection, allowing their pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures to start to form in a state that was roughly the same as before, but there was an extremely subtle difference. This change seemed to make the pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures less perfect. However, if the Grand Tao fragments were taken into consideration and the Grand Tao fragments that hadn't been obtained yet were taken into consideration, then the numerous imperfections would become a stroke of genius, and it would become the most perfect feature of this magic treasure. Under the extraordinary flow of time in that world, The 33 fall saints had already refined their own pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures in just one day in the outside world. In an instant, the world trembled again and again, walking on the edge of collapse again and again. After a total of 33 times, it finally stabilized and returned to its original appearance. It was obvious that the 33 pseudo-primordial origin spirit treasures had finally been fully formed. This was also normal. It had to be known that only one day had passed in the outside world. But in that world, countless trillions of years had passed. No matter how difficult it was to refine this pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasure, these false saints should have completed it after spending so much time. When the 33 pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures were all born, the eyes of the false saints flickered slightly. They were all waiting for an opportunity for the world to be destroyed. As long as this opportunity came, these false saints would be able to carry out the plan in their hearts and directly divide the great Tao. For a moment, they actually began to look forward to the subsequent actions of those false saints who had taken away their pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures. Luo Fan naturally did not care about what the 33 false saints would do after he left. After he left that world, he walked continuously in all directions. With his karma net, which had been upgraded countless times and whose power had increased by countless times compared to the beginning, he easily destroyed the pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures in one world after another. The great Tao fragments contained in them were transmitted to the void of Tao through the same method as before. As for the false saints in each world, he did not care at all. He did not carry out the task of capturing these false saints that he was supposed to carry out. On this day, Luo Fan arrived outside a strange world. This world was also a world where false saints were born. It looked like a seal that floated in the void, faintly emitting an inexplicable light. At the bottom of the seal, there were two strange words, karma. Obviously, this seal was the karma seal that was closely related to karma. However, this side of the world was unexpectedly calm. At the very least, it was calmer than the 10 worlds that Luo Fan had passed through previously. Not only were there no pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures guarding this world, even the false saints that existed in this world did not seem to have much of a presence, making this world look like an ordinary karma seal. There's actually such a world. It's rare. Luo Fan floated outside this world. He looked at the world from afar and thought to himself. With a thought, he sent out a karma net that directly crossed the void. Arriving outside the Imperial Seal, it suddenly wrapped around the Imperial Seal. Just as the karma net was about to touch the seal suddenly emitted some kind of inexplicable light and directly collided with the karma net. It produced an impact that was different from any other true Saint Theurgy, false Saint Theurgy, or pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures. In an instant, an impact that seemed to be the same kind of collision erupted and began to sweep in all directions, sweeping across the universe. Vaguely, an indescribably wondrous luck river flashed in the void. In the blink of an eye, it disappeared. This kind of collision produced a very difficult change, but it was definitely not a collision between a true Saint Theurgy and the power that erupted from an ordinary world. This kind of collision had the charm of the impact produced by a battle between two true Saint Theurgies. At this moment, the karma net naturally evolved into a brand new attack that attacked the world with a brand new mystery. The power released by the world also produced all kinds of incredible changes. All kinds of changes that Luo Fan could not understand were added to it. However, they intertwined with the changes that the karma net had evolved, forming a stalemate. As this stalemate appeared, layers of true saint-level treasure light began to emit from the point of contact between the two. It continued to radiate in all directions. What's going on? Another battle between true Saint Theurgies. Hasn't the matter been resolved? At this moment, not far away, in the world where Luo Fan was going to attack, the expression of a false saint who was sensing the changes in this area changed drastically. This was the only thought that flashed in his mind. He treated the battle between Luo Fan's Carmanet and the world as a battle between two true Saint Theurges. Similar to this false saint, the other false saints who were paying attention to the changes in this area were also filled with disbelief. They felt that the world seemed to have become different from what they had imagined. At this moment, Luo Fan, who was a participant in this battle, was shocked and exclaimed, "This is the shape of a primordial origin spiritual treasure." At this moment, he had already recognized it. The thing that was fighting with his karma net was not a true Saint Theurgy. Instead, it was a power that was naturally emitted from the shape of a primordial origin spiritual treasure when it was stimulated. In other words, the seal in front of him looked like an ordinary seal, but in fact, it was in the shape of a true primordial origin spiritual treasure. It contained endless mysteries and countless profundities that pseudo-saints could not understand. These boundless mysteries were normally hidden within the seal, hidden within the world. Even the false Saint Theurgis and the attacks of other pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures were not enough to stimulate it. However, once it was stimulated by the power of a true saint, it would erupt without reservation and produce a change similar to a true Saint Theurgy, emitting the power of a true Saint Theurgy. This was the essence of the power that was fighting with Luo Fan's Carmanet at this moment. Chapter 1519. Pure Text Online Reading Website. Domain name. Font. Color equals red. Squinting eyes face. B. Mobile synchronization. Please visit Disciple of a True Sage. I'm not a disciple of a true sage. On the other hand, you guys have a good opportunity to obtain the refining method of a true life treasure and refine this world into the shape of a true life treasure. Luo Fan said indifferently when he heard that. As he spoke, the Carmanet had already exchanged countless times with the endless brilliance and mysteries of the world. The various attacks that were released had also changed countless times, and they no longer looked the same as before. The layers of treasure light had already changed countless times at this moment, and its range had also expanded by countless times. Refining the world into the shape of a chaotic origin spiritual treasure was obviously not something that could be done with simple shaping. Any existence that was related to a true divine was not a simple existence. Even if it was just a shape, it would require a method that surpassed the false sage level to be able to create it. In other words, he had to obtain a method to refine a true chaos origin spirit treasure in order to mold the shape of the world into such a state. Although this was just the shape of a karma seal, it looked square and not much different from a normal seal. In fact, every detail on this seal, every arc, every rise and fall on it, and every change in color contained the profound mysteries of a true sage. It was because of these many details that this seal had such power just from its shape. It could actually fight on par with his karma net. Not a disciple of a true sage? How is that possible? If not a disciple of a true sage, how could he possess a true sage's mystique? If not a disciple of a true sage, how could he participate in the battle that will determine the fate of the universe? A voice came from the seal at this moment. Hearing this voice, Luo Fan only smiled. This kind of view was very normal. As the saying went, birds of a feather flocked together. During that period of time, Luo Fan had always been with Hangu Zi and the others who were also disciples of sages. He had also mastered the true sage divine ability that only they possessed, so he was regarded as a disciple of a true sage. That was perfectly normal. He wasn't in the mood to explain and said, "You should know. What you have condensed now is only the shape of a true sage treasure, but is not a real true sage treasure. Against my true sage sacred art, it is impossible for him to win. At most, he would only be able to hold on for a slightly longer period of time. What was the point of that? Why don't you all take the initiative to give up the great Tao fragment? This way, it'll be easier for me to report back, and you all can also avoid the fate of being damaged." Why wouldn't I? What he got in return was a faint chuckle. "You're all fake saints. Do you really think that our will can be shaken by words? Not to mention, all the great path fragments have already been condensed into the shape of this world, becoming resources in the form of true sage treasures. Even if we could take them out, since we have already decided to fight, why would we take them out? I see. No wonder you can actually give the shape of true sage treasures to this world. Luo Fan suddenly understood at this time. True sage treasures were primordial spiritual treasures, but they were completely different from true sage sacred arts. No matter what true sage sacred arts were, they were just sacred arts. Once there was no opponent, they would naturally collapse, unless the person who used the sacred art maintained it. This, obviously, did not have the true eternal and indestructible characteristics of a true sage. But primordial spiritual treasures were different. Primordial spiritual treasures were actually another true sage. Once it was born, it would naturally have the characteristics of a true sage. It would be truly eternal and indestructible, and even the chaotic state could not be shaken or destroyed. To refine such an existence, even a real sage might not be able to so easily. Only the existence of a true sage wanted to refine this. That would be a dream. If they could refine it and use it on themselves, they would have long become true sages. Why would they still need to refine this primordial spiritual treasure? It was precisely because of this characteristic of a true sage treasure that Luo Fan was actually quite puzzled about how those false sages could actually refine this world into the form of a primordial spiritual treasure. However, previously, he only thought that this might be some special method of those false sages that he did not know about and did not think too much about it. At this moment, when he heard the words of the fake saint, only then did he know that they had used a large amount of Grand Tao fragments as refining materials, and with the mysterious characteristics of the Grand Tao fragments, they were barely able to refine the shape of this chaotic origin spiritual treasure. This had resolved a huge doubt in his heart. I see. This time, it's an eye-opener. After thinking it through, Luo Fan could not help but exclaim in admiration. Those false sages were not worried that Luo Fan would know how they refined the shape of the primordial spiritual treasure. Anyway, even if he knew, it would not affect their current protection from the rain. What was there to worry about? In fact, the false sage who had been speaking even said, "If you're willing, I can hand over the refining method of this true sage treasure to you. It's also not a problem to turn the great path fragments into resources to refine this true sage treasure. If you're willing to give it to me, I'm naturally willing to accept it. However, it's impossible for me to let you guys off because of this." Luo Fan only smiled. Why would we think that? We're all false sages. Whose decision will be changed so easily? The false sage laughed. Although this refining method is exquisite, it's impossible to refine it successfully at the false sage level. Even refining its shape requires a huge amount of resources. We really want to see how you'll fall out with other sages for resources. The false sage revealed his plan without any scruples. Luo Fan only smiled when he heard that. At this time, a ray of light rushed out from the seal, instantly crossing the seal and the encirclement of the net of karma. It directly arrived in front of Luo Fan, condensed into a jade slip, and floated in front of him. Luo Fan took a look. He knew that this was a bit of memory. A bit of memory about the refining method of the primordial spiritual treasure and how to give the shape of the true sage treasure to heaven and earth. It looked like a jade slip, but it actually had no physical form at all. It was the purest and most condensed information memory. Now, he did not have to worry about those false sages doing anything to the memory. He did not stand on ceremony. With a thought, the jade slip entered his body and instantly disintegrated into a huge amount of information that fused into his memory. In the blink of an eye, he already knew exactly how the primal origin spiritual treasure was refined, and he understood even more. He understood how to use the great path fragments to extract some of the attributes of this primordial spiritual treasure as much as possible. For example, its shape, its material, its aura, and its power, and so on. In fact, according to that method, if there were enough great path fragments, he could even completely refine this primordial spiritual treasure. This method was indeed heaven-defying. However, Luo Fan knew that it was useless at a glance. There was no other reason. Just refining its shape and giving it to heaven and earth required all the great path fragments that could give birth to false sages. If he wanted to extract more attributes of the primordial spiritual treasure, he would need even more great path fragments. If he wanted to successfully refine this primordial spiritual treasure in the end. Not to mention that the great paths of all the great paths in the universe that could give birth to false sages were not enough. Even 10 worlds combined would be a little difficult. Such a huge consumption. Even if Luo Fan dared to be ruthless, it would be impossible for him to do it. And the name of this primordial spiritual treasure was the Karma Seal. After successfully refining it, the Dharma treasure obtained was a primordial spiritual treasure called the Karma Seal. Once this Dharma treasure was born, it would control all the karma in the entire perfect world. It would even define all the karma in the perfect world. Moreover, it could move freely in the state of chaos. It would not be controlled by all the pressure and impact in the chaos. It was like a true saint. The power of such a Dharma treasure was not something that any pseudo-primordial spiritual treasure could compare to. The refining method of the Dharma treasure did not contain many words, but it was the same as all other true sage mystical abilities. Although there were not many words, it did not look complicated at first glance. However, it contained endless profundities and endless secrets. At this moment, in the memories that the false sages had given Li Hao, apart from the refining method of the Karma Seal, most of the other memories were the results of their research on the refining method. Karma Net, Karma Seal. This true sage mystical ability and the primordial spiritual treasure seemed to have an extremely close relationship. Luo Fan's heart skipped a beat as such a thought flashed through his mind. Back then, he had obtained the cultivation method of the Karma Net, a true sage mystical ability from a supreme supremacy. Back then, through the memories of the supreme supremacy, he knew that this true sage mystical ability had been obtained by chance when he was traveling in a certain major kiliacosm. Back then, he had only cultivated a small part of this mystical ability and could not even be considered to have truly cultivated it. It was only when this mystical ability fell into the hands of Luo Fan that it shone brightly and became the basis for him to participate in the fate of the universe this time. Apart from this Karma Net, he had never heard of anyone else obtaining a true sage mystical ability. All the other false sages who had mastered the true sage mystical ability were disciples of sages. And now, the only false sage that he had seen who had obtained the refining method of a true sage treasure had obtained the refining method of the Karma Seal. One was the Karma Net, and the other was the Karma Seal. This made him suspect that the two were related. There's also the Heaven Sealing Formation. This seems to be closely related to the Karma Net and the Karma Seal. Luo Fan's heart suddenly skipped a beat. He thought of the true saint-level techniques that he had encountered previously that were not obtained by a true sage. For a moment, he was inexplicably touched. Mystical abilities, primordial spiritual treasures, and formations. No matter how he looked at it, they seemed to be a series. His thoughts started to wander. What else is there next? Will there be true sage pills, true sage restrictions, true sage martial arts, true sage techniques? How is it? Is this treasure powerful? Are you satisfied? The false sage inside the seal smiled. Hearing this, Luo Fan returned to his senses from his chaotic thoughts. He smiled and said, "It's a very good treasure, but it's a pity that it's a little difficult to refine. This might be a little difficult for us. However, it might not be the case for a true sage disciple like you," the false sage said with a smile. Luo Fan only smiled. "I've said it before, I'm not a true sage disciple." He had already said this earlier, but to those false sages, they obviously couldn't believe it. Fake saint was a synonym for stubbornness and stubbornness. How could they change so easily? This time, it was the false sages who couldn't be bothered to reply. "Now, the results are about to be out," the false sage said with a smile. "You guys don't seem to be worried at all?" Luo Fan was really curious this time. One had to know that there was only one outcome for the battle between the true sage mystical abilities and the primordial spiritual treasures. The heaven and earth would fail. The true sage mystical abilities would win. Now that the results were about to be out, didn't that mean that the heaven and earth were about to fail and be destroyed? Why were these false sages so calm? This is an outcome that we've already expected. What's there to worry about? The false sage said with a smile. Fellow Taoist, I'm not as good as you. I'm not as good as you. Luo Fan sighed. At this moment, the battle between the net of karma and the heaven and earth had not reached the final outcome. After all, even the initial joint attack of the 33 false sages could last longer than this. How could the shape of the primordial spiritual treasures last for less time than the combined forces of the 33 false sages? The reason why the false sage said that the results were about to be out was because, at this moment, in the battle between the true sage mystical abilities and the heaven and earth, the true sage mystical abilities had gradually gained the upper hand. In other words, the original state of being on par had been broken. Perhaps ordinary cultivators would not admit defeat, but to the false sages, it was already enough for them to see the final outcome. It was enough for them to confirm that they had failed. Of course, even if they confirmed that they had failed. However, the false sages would not give up just like that. Those who should resist would still resist, and those who should attack would still attack. This kind of victory lasted for a full 10 days before it ended. In other words, the heaven and earth that had turned into the shape of the karma seal lasted for a full 10 days before finally being unable to withstand the attack of the net of karma. All the power it emitted was finally completely annihilated. The power of the net of karma directly bombarded the karma seal. At this moment, the entire karma seal shook violently. Its originally extremely stable state began to distort. Ripples that completely destroyed its shape began to appear from the spot where it was bombarded by the power of the net of karma. The ripples spread to the entire karma seal at an extremely fast speed, causing the karma seal's subtle form to gradually change. As it changed, bits of great Tao fragments began to continuously scatter from various parts of the karma seal. They began to gradually condense in the void, gradually transforming into a complete great Tao. Noticing this, Luo Fan naturally did not hesitate. He raised his hand and waved it. In an instant, a passage connected to the void of Tao appeared out of thin air around the seal of karma. It began to absorb the scattered fragments of the great Tao and transfer them into the void of Tao through the passage. At the same time, he controlled the net of karma and constantly bombarded the karma seal with powerful attacks. He constantly distorted the shape of the karma seal and destroyed the characteristics of a primordial origin spirit treasure. As the karma seal lost more and more of its primordial origin spirit treasure characteristics, the great Tao fragments that were emitted from the karma seal became more and more numerous, and the fragments also became larger and larger. Sure enough, it was just as described in the memories that Luo Fan received. To give the shape of the karma seal to the world, it had to be fused with 10 complete great Taos. As the power of the net of karma constantly bombarded the karma seal, the great Tao fragments that were scattered from it had already exceeded the amount of 5 great Taos in just a few dozen breaths. At this time, the speed of the great Tao fragments that were separated from it still didn't slow down at all. They were still as fast as before, and the form of the karma seal hadn't been reduced by half. All these signs showed that the great Tao fragments that were lost were not more than half of the original great Tao fragments. However, Luo Fan faintly felt that something was wrong. The world was strangely calm at this moment. The saints in the world didn't say anything because of this change. It didn't even resist. This couldn't be described as having a good mentality. It can't be that they don't have any power to resist at all, right? Luo Fan thought to himself. As soon as this thought appeared, it was rejected by him. As a false saint, even if he had lost the pseudo-primordial origin spirit treasure that could break through the shackles of the world, it was impossible for him to not have any power to resist the attacks of the world. At most, the resistance might not be enough. Under such circumstances, the false saint in this world actually didn't have any reaction. This matter was worth pondering. He thought for a moment. Luo Fan couldn't figure out what the problem was and sighed. He didn't care anymore. No matter what the problem was, he had already obtained the great Tao fragments that he needed at this moment. That meant that he had already achieved his goal. As for the rest, why should he care? Therefore, he soon felt at ease and didn't care about anything else. He just controlled the karma net to continuously send out power to bombard the karma seal. The further he went, the more difficult it was to change the shape of the karma seal. In other words, the further he went, the more difficult it was to escape from the great Tao fragments in the karma seal. The speed at which he escaped also became slower. Originally, the bombardment of power was densely packed with countless great Tao fragments. However, as time passed, there were more than 10 bombardments after more than half a day. Just now, there might be some great Tao fragments that were blasted out. Even though the sparse grand Tao fragments weren't enough to make Luo Fan feel agitated, it still made him feel slightly unsatisfied. However, even though the net of karma was a true divine theurgy, it could change endlessly when facing a true divine theurgy. Boundless transformations. However, the power that it could unleash was extremely powerful. But it wasn't infinite. This was especially true when he was facing a stationary and unresisting target. At this moment, even if he clearly knew that this kind of bombardment was a little weak for the seal of karma, and the speed at which it changed shape was a little slow, he had no other choice. He could only forcefully endure it and wait for the great Tao fragment to break free bit by bit. This process lasted for 3 days. 3 days after the karma seal was bombarded, the net of karma sent out a final strike. This caused the karma seal's shape to completely change, no longer containing any characteristics of a primordial essence spirit treasure. At this moment, a large piece of great Tao fragment that seemed to be 1/10 the size of the great Tao gushed out from the karma seal. After this great Tao fragment appeared, it was directly sucked away by the passage and sent into the void of Tao. Then, the passage suddenly shook and collapsed. In the blink of an eye, it disappeared without a trace. It's finally done. Luo Fan let out a long breath and thought to himself. Then, with a wave of his hand, the net of karma had already broken away from the previous seal of karma that had become shapeless, like an irregular ball of plasticine. In other words, it turned into an ordinary silk net and directly rushed into his body, staying silent among the many major chiliocosms in his body. After putting away the net of karma, Luo Fan didn't leave immediately like before. Instead, he quietly floated in the void and looked at the world in front of him thoughtfully. From the beginning of the bombardment and the great Tao fragments being continuously stripped away, there was no movement in this world at all. There must be a large number of false saints in there. None of them spoke a word, and none of them showed any signs of resistance. All of this made him suspect what they were planning and what they were waiting for. At this moment, he had already completed his mission, but he began to be curious about what they were doing. He planned to stay here and see if there would be any unexpected changes in this world. "Let me see what you guys are planning," he muttered in his heart, but there was an inexplicable anticipation in his eyes. Chapter 15:20. That irregularly shaped plasticine suddenly began to emit an inexplicable and mysterious splendor. The splendor was so mysterious and profound. After it was emitted, it was naturally pulsating in the nothingness, as if it was a real substance. Within it, one could faintly see countless complex and mysterious Tao patterns surging, piling up, combining, and changing. As the runes changed, the plasticine-like world suddenly seemed to be hammered by a hammer, and its shape began to gradually change. The original irregularities were gradually hammered flat, and gradually, it looked like a seal. "I see." Luo Fan smiled bitterly at this moment, vaguely understanding something. However, he did not say much, nor did he leave directly. Instead, he directly floated in the nothingness, quietly watching the transformation of this world, sensing the inexplicable splendor that was emitted from that world, and carefully memorizing the many complex and indescribable runes within the splendor. This process of transformation lasted for a month. During this entire month, the splendor was changing the appearance of that world bit by bit, making that world slowly change into the shape of a seal. A month later, when the brilliance gradually faded away, the world had already changed its appearance. It had once again become a square seal. It was the shape of the karma seal. Of course, this karma seal was a little different from the one that Luo Fan first saw. There were many flaws and imperfections on it, and it vaguely looked like the seal was not polished to perfection. In fact, the word karma at the bottom of the seal was even more blurry at this time, and it was faintly discernible, and there was still a long way to go before it was truly formed. However, even though there were many flaws and imperfections, there were still many flaws and imperfections. When Luo Fan looked at the seal, he felt that it was more stable than before. It felt more powerful. Vaguely, it was even comparable to a real, true divine ability. The reason for this change. The fundamental reason was that there was a strange aura on the seal, an aura that had been hammered and tempered. This aura, even though this seal wasn't as perfect as it was before, and it didn't even match the details of the seal of karma, it wasn't any stronger or more terrifying. This was like the difference between well-tempered steel and ordinary pig iron. Although the two were made of the same material, no matter how good-looking the pig iron was, it would never be as strong as well-tempered steel. As expected, he's using my net of karma to temper the world, so that the world can still maintain the appearance of a chaotic origin treasure even after the Great Path fragments have been taken away. Luo Fan sighed. At this moment, the conjecture he had made before was confirmed by him. This was the true form of the primordial essence spirit treasure. Normally speaking, if an existence who was not a true saint wanted to refine it, they could only rely on the great Tao fragment to forcefully shape it. However, he didn't expect the false saint in the world to think of a shortcut in the impossible. He actually used the true divine ability to bombard the world and condensed the true divine aura that was brought about by the bombardment. It was like hammering pig iron into a sword, forcefully shaping the world into the appearance of the seal of karma at this moment, in a situation where there was no need for the great Tao fragment at all, and because of the many true divine auras that were added to the tempering. Therefore, at this moment, although the form didn't completely match the appearance of the seal of karma, it was controlled by the true divine aura that was inserted into it. It became more in line with the nature of the seal of karma, making it more stable and more powerful. With a thought, Luo Fan raised his hand and pointed. A net of karma directly crossed the sky and wrapped around the seal of karma. It began to produce endless attacks that targeted the seal of karma and blasted towards the world. At this moment, the seal of karma suddenly erupted with an infinite amount of mysterious light. In the void, all sorts of unimaginable attacks of the true sage level directly shattered the attack of the net of karma. In an instant, it entangled with the net of karma. It was like a battle between two real, true divine abilities, and it began to go through an almost endless cycle. The extremely bright and dazzling treasure light began to spread in all directions at this moment. This light was much brighter and more dazzling than the light that Luo Fan had emitted when he attacked the world in order to obtain the great Tao fragment. This was enough to show that the power of the seal of karma in front of him was already far stronger than the seal of karma from before. Your Excellency, why are you doing this? Although we used your Excellency's ability to temper the world, it didn't cause much harm to you. On the contrary, it allowed you to obtain so many great Tao fragments. Why do you still want to attack us now? The voice of the false saint came from the world. There was no panic in the voice, but there was doubt. When Luo Fan heard this, he only smiled faintly and said, "Although it didn't cause much harm, you still used me after all. Although I'm not narrow-minded, I also have a grudge. If I don't teach you a lesson, I won't be able to accept it." He said these words with a faint smile, but it made people not know how to refute him. Isn't this lesson a little too big? Now, our world and your Excellency's ability will be entangled forever, and our world will be fixed here. Is this still a lesson? The false saint in the world said. He did not sound flustered or exasperated. Instead, he appeared rather calm and composed, as if he was not talking about his world suffering an irreparable fate. Instead, it was as normal as if it was raining today and the sun would rise tomorrow. Luo Fan didn't respond to this. He just smiled and said, "Perhaps. Perhaps your world won't be able to last forever." Hearing this, the false saint in the world didn't answer anymore. At this moment, the battle between the Karma Net and the Karma Seal had already reached its climax. There were hundreds of millions of mysterious attacks that were generated and changed between the two at every instant. The methods that were displayed were beyond the false saint level, and they were extremely profound. There were countless mysterious secrets contained within them, even though he had seen many battles between true saints and excellencies. At this moment, Luo Fan looked at the battle between the Karma Net and the Karma Seal again and felt some inexplicable comprehension surging in his heart. The Karma Net. There seemed to be a rather close connection between the Karma Seals. At this moment, the various attacks that the two of them had evolved were like two brothers from the same sect sparring with each other. The various defenses were magnificent, and the changes were intense and balanced. It seemed to be more exciting than the battle between the true saints and excellencies that Luo Fan used to be in. Compared to before, the battle between the Karma Net and the Karma Seal was even more exciting. Although the previous karmic imprints were also karmic imprints, their transformations were always slower than the karmic web, and they were constantly running for their lives. The various transformations were all defensive or offensive due to the stimulation of the karmic web. However, it didn't display much of its profundity. How could it be like now, coming and going? Both of them displayed their profundities to the fullest. Luo Fan originally only wanted to teach this world a lesson and show the false saint in that world that it wasn't easy to make use of him. However, when the Karma Net and the Karma Seal really fought, he suddenly realized that this seemed to be extremely beneficial to the evolution of his Karma Net. It also had an extremely strong effect on excavating the various potential of the Karma Net. He discovered this. However, he instantly stopped thinking about teaching a lesson. Instead, he planned to let the Karma Net and the Karma Seal fight for a long time. He wanted to see how the Karma Net would evolve in the end, and how much its power would increase. As for the matter of seizing the great Tao fragments in the pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasure, he no longer cared about it. It wasn't that he looked down on the other false saints, but after so many times of seizing the great Tao fragments, he already knew how strong the resistance of ordinary false saints would be. He also knew that it was impossible for the other false saints to complete the task too quickly. It might take a few years, or even a few decades, or even a few hundred years to seize all the pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures they were responsible for. In this way, why would he worry about not having enough time? Moreover, even if there wasn't enough time, so what if he completed the task slower than the other false saints? No one stipulated that he had to be faster than the other false saints, nor did they stipulate that he couldn't be slower than the other false saints. So what if he completed the task a few years, decades, or centuries later than the others? Would anyone have any objections? It was precisely because of these considerations that Luo Fan wasn't anxious at all at this moment. He just floated there quietly while comprehending the Karma Net and the changes that were revealed by the battle between the Karma Seals that belonged to the true saint level. On the other hand, he was carefully waiting for the evolution of the Karma Net that was constantly stimulating its potential. The incident passed by slowly. In the blink of an eye, several years had passed. The battle between the Karma Net and the Karma Seals had unknowingly evolved to a certain limit. The layers of treasure light that were revealed had also expanded to the limit, reaching an area that the Karma Net and the Karma Seals could not reach at all when they fought each other for the first time. The living beings in the many worlds that couldn't sense the changes here the first time could sense the earth-shattering battle that was happening here. It also made the false saints that were waiting for Luo Fan to conquer gradually feel the inexplicable impact of the inexplicable panic. They directly created billions of special techniques to counter the incredible power that the Karma Net had displayed over the years. However, after all these years, the war between the two had developed to this stage and was about to reach its limit. After all, the karma seals were only the shape of the real karma seals, but they weren't the real karma seals. Even if they had the power of the real mystical abilities, it was impossible for them to be like the true saint mystical abilities. After all these years of fighting, at this moment, the mysterious shape of the karma seals had been gradually excavated to the limit. However, it had already been gradually excavated to the limit. Gradually, the shape of the karma seal. There were already faint signs of instability. It felt that if this continued, the shape of the karma seals of heaven and earth would gradually collapse. On this day, a voice came from the karma seals. I didn't expect that I would die at this time. I originally thought that by condensing the world into the shape of a true saint treasure, I would be able to survive this tribulation. I didn't expect that this would accelerate the speed of destruction. The voice contained indescribable regret. However, there was no pain or hatred. It was the voice of the false saint. In this voice, the appearance of a man gradually appeared on the side of the seal. It was a man who looked to be in his 20s. His appearance was ordinary, but his eyes revealed a light of wisdom that was deeper than that of an ordinary false saint. In the depths of his eyes, there was indescribable regret. As the man appeared, 6 figures appeared on both sides of him at the same time. There were men, women, old, and young figures among these 6 figures. However, compared to the man who appeared first, the light of wisdom in their eyes was a little weaker. They looked like ordinary false saints. After waiting for so many years, you're finally willing to show yourselves? Luo Fan glanced at the 7 of them. He said with a smile, I have no choice but to show myself. I have to let you know who died in your hands, right? The false saint who appeared first said with a smile. You're really open-minded, Luo Fan said with a smile. The appearance of the seal gradually changed. There were faint signs that it was about to lose the form of the karma seals. He finally raised his hand and waved. In an instant, the karma net that was originally fighting to the death with the karma seals, as if it was going to be entangled forever until the end of time and the end of the world, shook slightly. It directly left the battle and turned into an ordinary silk net in the blink of an eye. It fell into Luo Fan's hands. After the karma seal lost its opponent, it naturally restrained all its mysterious light and power, turning back into a square seal that floated quietly in the void. This change was so sudden that even the false saints could not react in time. How was this possible? For the first time, the false saint who appeared first lost his composure. He stared at the karma net in Luo Fan's hands in disbelief and muttered, Could that be a true saint treasure? His eyes suddenly lit up. However, very soon, the light in his eyes dimmed. No, even if it's a true sage treasure, it can't be like this. It seems like the control of the true sage's omniscient powers is dozens of times stronger than the average false sage. After muttering like this, his expression returned to calmness, and a faint smile appeared on his face again. Thank you for showing mercy, Your Excellency. You're thanking me too early. Luo Fan smiled faintly. Before the false saint could understand what was going on, he pointed at the world. In an instant, another karma net rushed out from the endless worlds in his body. In the blink of an eye, it crossed the void and directly wrapped around the karma seal. It began to produce an endless attack that exceeded the limits of the false saint's understanding. It continuously blasted out from the karma net and pounced on the karma seal. In an instant, the karma seal blasted out, blocking the attack with a power that also exceeded the limits of the false saint's understanding. The false saint was stunned at first. Then he smiled bitterly. Just now, we used Your Excellency's mystical ability to refine the world. Now, you're using our mystical ability to refine the world. It's an eye for an eye. As he spoke, he shook his head and gradually disappeared. As he disappeared, the false saints around him also disappeared, causing the surface of the karma seal to return to its original flat appearance. It could no longer be seen that the previous sages were there. Luo Fan rubbed the karma net in his hand and looked at the karma net that was fighting with the karma seal in front of him. A faint smile appeared on his face. Just as the false saint had said, he was indeed relying on the power of the karma seal to refine his karma net. The changes in the karma net in his hand after the battle with the karma seal were enough to show how much benefit the battle with the karma seal had as stimulating the potential of the karma net. Since that was the case, how could Luo Fan let go of such a good opportunity? One must know that he did not only have one karma net, but more than 20 of them. There are so many karma nets. If he let go of such an opportunity, it would be almost impossible to find the karma seal to refine the karma net in the future. If he wanted to stimulate the potential of the karma net, he did not know how much time it would take and how many battles he would have to go through to achieve it. With such considerations, how could Luo Fan let go of such an opportunity? Needless to say, back then, the world had relied on his karma net to temper itself. Now that Luo Fan had turned the tables, it could be considered as revenge. The karma seal was also like the heaven sealing array. It could not retain the profoundness and power that it had evolved during the battle with the true saint's remarkable ability. Therefore, this time, Luo Fan's new karma net fought with the karma seal. However, both of them were the same as the previous time. They both evolved from zero, but they did not evolve to the limit all of a sudden. The karma seal could not withstand it all at once, although the entire evolution process was different from before. But in general, the increase in power was no different from before. It was still improving bit by bit and evolving bit by bit. After another few years, the karma seal once again reached its limit. Luo Fan did not hesitate. He raised his hand and waved again. The karma net that was fighting with the karma seal shook and broke away from the battle. It turned into a soft silk net and fell into Luo Fan's hand. Even compared to before, it was easier for him to recall the karma net, and he could do it as he pleased. The entire process of breaking away. It was also more harmonious than before, and the turbulence it caused was also smaller. The reason for such a change was that Luo Fan's understanding of the karma web and the karma seal had risen to another level through his observation of the numerous profundities of the battle between the karma web and the karma seal, and his control of the karma web had unknowingly improved as well. Such a gain. It was something that Luo Fan did not expect to appear at this moment. However, this made him secretly happy, and he was secretly satisfied with his decision to stay here. After casually absorbing the karma net into the many major chiliocosms in his body, Luo Fan raised his hand again and pointed. Another karma net rushed out of his body and wrapped around the karma seal in the blink of an eye. He began the previous two battles. Boundless layers of treasured light instantly spread out from the top of the mountain. Just now, when the karma seal was not attacked by the karma net, the false saint in the world was already able to control the karma seal to escape. And with the reaction speed of those false saints, they should have been able to react long ago when Luo Fan retracted and released the karma net. It was enough to control the karma seal and escape. However, throughout the entire process, the karma seal did not move at all. It did not escape at all. It was like a dead object that floated there quietly, waiting for the arrival of the karma net and the attack of the karma net. This was naturally not because those false saints had psychological problems or were addicted to being abused. Instead, it was because they knew very well that Luo Fan now had the ability to destroy this world completely. Now, Luo Fan was only using this world to temper his mystical abilities and stimulate the potential of his mystical abilities. That was why he had to change his true saint mystical abilities one after another and start from scratch. If he was angered and changed his mind, he would be able to use any of the true saint mystical abilities that he had completed evolving and stimulating his potential. It would be enough to destroy all the defenses of the karma seal in a short period of time and directly destroy the karma seal, which was also this world. It was precisely because of this deterrence that these false sages stayed there obediently. Even though their worlds could move and they could escape, they suppressed their urges and stayed there instead of escaping. In this regard, it had to be said that they were very sensible. This made Luo Fan's displeasure towards them fade away, and the idea of destroying them faintly in his heart also became less and less. Next, it was a cycle of a few years. Luo Fan sent out more than 20 karma nets one by one outside his body and continuously attacked the karma seal again and again. With the special connection between the karma seal and the karma net, he continuously stimulated the power of the karma seal. Chapter 1521. Over the past 200 years, there would be shocking movements in the various worlds from time to time, which are transmitted to where Luo Fan was. It let him know that the other false sages besides him had been working hard and fighting all these years. Although they had mastered the true sage mystiques, the false sages they were targeting did not. However, those false sages had superb methods after all. Even without the true sage mystiques, they could still bring great trouble to the disciples of the sages by relying on various special methods. This made it impossible for them to speed up the process of collecting the great Tao fragments. It had been more than 200 years, but none of the disciples of the saints had completed their mission. They had collected the pseudo-primordial chaos spiritual treasures in the part of the world they were in charge of, as well as the false saints that they needed to sacrifice. At this moment, there were still many movements coming from the various worlds, allowing Luo Fan to clearly know that they were still working hard and fighting. On this day, the seal of karma, which had been on the verge of collapsing more than 20 times, was on the verge of collapsing again. The attack emitted by the seal of karma belonged to the true sage level. The resistance of the true sage level was suddenly blasted away by the attack of the net of karma. The attack of the net of karma instantly landed on the seal of karma. Upon realizing this, Luo Fan sighed. With a wave of his hand, the net of karma, which was originally erupting with boundless power and was enveloped by an unknown number of profound and mysterious powers, suddenly trembled. All of its power was instantly withdrawn, and it directly turned into an ordinary net. With a slight sway, it had already arrived in his hand. He gently grabbed it. It's a pity that this seal of karma isn't perfect enough and can't last longer. Otherwise, my gains would be greater, Luo Fan, who was a little dissatisfied, thought. The potential of a net of karma was almost infinite. If all its potential was stimulated, once it unleashed its power, even the various worlds could be instantly annihilated, and even a large part of the entire Earth and universe might be instantly shattered. Such terrifying power was obviously not something that the net of karma that Luo Fan had mastered at this moment could compare to. Therefore, it was obvious that although it had been stimulated and improved by the seal of karma, however, there was still a large portion of the potential of the net of karma that had yet to be unleashed. There was still a large portion of it sleeping. However, this was not because the karma seal could only reach this step, nor was it because the stimulation from the karma seal could only reach this step. In reality, if it was the real karma seal, it would definitely be able to be continuously stimulated. After countless years, all the potential of this karma seal would be stimulated, allowing this karma net to truly reach the peak state that Luo Fan had envisioned. It was a pity. Luo Fan's karma web was indeed a true karma web, a true, divine, remarkable power. However, the karma seal in front of Luo Fan's eyes. However, it was not the true karma seal. It was just a form of the karma seal that was bestowed upon the world. Compared to the real seal of karma, it was billions of times weaker. How could it do what the real seal of karma could? At this moment, the fact that they could only eat until this point and stimulate the potential of the karma web to this point before they could no longer withstand it showed that the false sage's method of constructing the karma seal was extremely superb, making the karma seal extraordinarily sturdy. Thank you for showing mercy, Your Excellency. At this moment, the few false saints appeared at the side of the karma seal again. Among them, the false saint who spoke the most bowed and said calmly, "For more than 200 years in the outside world and billions of trillion years in that world, they have been constantly being bombarded by the net of karma, a true divine, remarkable power. The entire world was constantly shaking, but this did not leave any traces on the faces of these false saints. None of them had any change in expression. There wasn't any hatred or resentment in their eyes. Every single one of them was calm. However, They had the demeanor of the false saints that Luo Fan knew of. Seeing these false saints, Luo Fan only smiled and said, "I have to thank you for tempering my remarkable power. We also have to thank you for giving us so much time." At this moment, a leisurely voice entered Luo Fan's ears, as well as the ears of the false saints in the Seal of Karma. When Luo Fan heard this, a faint smile appeared on his face. It was as if he had waited for what he had been waiting for a long time. However, when the false saints heard this voice, their expressions changed. Then, his figure directly disappeared into the Seal of Karma. No one knew what he did, but the Seal of Karma turned into a mysterious light and directly rushed into the depths of the universe. The speed at which it flew was the fastest that Luo Fan had ever seen in the world. Almost in a flash, it had already disappeared from Luo Fan's sight. "Fellow Taoist, why did you leave? This person is our enemy, so we have to work together to face him." The person who suddenly spoke transmitted his voice directly to the Seal of Karma that was quickly leaving. "This matter has nothing to do with us anymore. We have already paid a sufficient price and are confident that we can protect ourselves. There's no need for us to get involved in this mess." This voice came from the Seal of Karma, and then it was completely silent. No matter what the person who tried to persuade him said, there was no reply. "I didn't expect that after seeing my remarkable power, you actually have the courage to come here and take the initiative to attack." At this moment, Luo Fan's expression contained a hint of interest. At this moment, a total of 16 worlds appeared out of thin air around Luo Fan. Although they were quite far away from each other, they had already formed a strange formation that enveloped Luo Fan in the center. The person who had suddenly spoken was one of the 16 worlds. It was also the world where the formation eye of the entire strange formation was located. These 16 worlds happened to be Luo Fan's next target. At this moment, from the looks of it, they had already communicated for a long time. In fact, they had even practiced this formation countless times. These 16 worlds gathered together and formed a formation to besiege Luo Fan. However, it was not a coincidence. It was not that they just happened to be the combination of the 16 Luo Fan's targets. After all, a false saint was an existence that could stand out from zero in a world and become eternal and indestructible. Foresight and judgment. Naturally, they could not be inferior. They had already known the rules of Luo Fan's attacks through the worlds that Luo Fan had attacked at the beginning. Naturally, they had guessed where Luo Fan's next target was. It was also because of this that they had enough motivation to work together. They were able to unite against a common enemy and take the initiative to attack Luo Fan. To a false saint, the wholeheartedly scheming of a false saint in a world could bring huge trouble to the disciples of a sage who had mastered the mystical abilities of a true saint. Now, in the 16 worlds, the combined power of more than 200 false saints was definitely 10 times or even 100 times stronger than a single world. If a false saint under an ordinary sage encountered such a lineup, even if it was unlikely that he would fail, it would not be strange for him to be trapped for thousands or tens of thousands of years. However, fortunately, Luo Fan was not a false saint under an ordinary sage. At this moment, he was facing these worlds. Looking at the way the many pseudo-primordial chaos spiritual treasures moved around each other, his heart was calm. He did not feel nervous because of this, nor did he feel aggrieved from being schemed against. Courage is something that no false saint will ever lack. The false saint who had spoken earlier continued to say, "Is that so? Then let me see how effective your courage is after combining." Luo Fan only smiled. At this moment, the strange formation formed by the 16 worlds and more than 200 pseudo-primordial chaos spiritual treasures began to slowly activate. In an instant, all the major chiliocosm within the encirclement of these worlds suddenly collapsed into thin air and disappeared without a trace in the blink of an eye, as if they had never existed before. When Luo Fan saw this, he instantly knew that this was an extremely strange erasure power. It was almost similar to the state of chaos, the power to erase everything that dared to offend it. If it were not for the fact that Luo Fan was now a false saint who could roughly control the mystical abilities of a true saint, even his memories of the major kiliocosm might have been erased during this erasure, and he would have completely forgotten the existence of these major kiliocosm. This was also the feeling of all living beings who had originally sensed the existence of these major kiliocosm, except for false saints. At this moment, they had completely forgotten the existence of these major kiliocosm, as if there had never been such a major kiliocosm in the world. This kind of erasure force continued to move forward, constantly approaching Luo Fan. Seeing this, Luo Fan knew that if he did not resist, his body and his existence would also be completely erased by this erasure power. Knowing this, how would he dare to be negligent? With a thought, the karma net between the major kiliocosm in his hand that had yet to be retracted spread out and wrapped around him. It formed an almost eternal, unshakable, and unbreakable defensive layer that protected his body firmly. At this moment, the erasure power directly came into contact with the karma net. A shocking shock instantly began to spread in all directions from the point of contact. A strange light actually began to flicker slightly. This kind of light was different from the treasure light produced by the battle between true sages. It didn't have the powerful aura of a true sage that was contained in the treasure light. What it had was the aura of pure power. This aura of power could only tell others how huge and terrifying the impact here was. It could only let them understand what kind of unbelievably terrifying fate they would suffer if they were to approach this place. The collision between a true sage omniscient power and a non-true sage omniscient power could actually produce such a light that was similar to the collision between true sage omniscient powers. This was enough to show how terrifying the formation created by the combined forces of more than 200 fake sages in the 16 worlds was. Not bad, Luo Fan inwardly praised. There was no need for him to react at all. The karma web started to react rapidly in an instant. Boundless mysterious lights and attacks started to burst out of the karma web. In an extremely strange way, it fought with the surrounding erasure power. At the same time, the erasure power also produced all kinds of incredible changes. Although it was still erasure, it had a completely different performance, showing a completely different erasure method. All kinds of changes. They actually vaguely caught up to the various mysterious attacks and powers that the karma net had transformed into. At this moment, the 16 worlds, as well as the pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures around them, were rapidly changing in their revolutions. Their speed had almost increased to a level that could not even be described with speed. The flashing posture had even surpassed time and space. It had surpassed the perception of all living beings. It was also because of this change that the original 200 or so pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures and the 16 worlds had vaguely filled the surrounding void. From the outside, it looked like a completely sealed ball had appeared. This appearance, it was very obvious that the false saints had relied on their own wisdom and control of the formation to vaguely catch up to the evolution of the karma net's own mystique. This barely formed a relatively balanced state at this moment. As this state of balance appeared, the light that was formed from the collision of the erasure power and the karma net, which was similar to the treasure light formed from the collision of the true saint's mystique, became increasingly intense at this moment. Its range of influence also became wider and wider. Vaguely, it actually spread out of the formation and began to spread towards the various worlds in the universe. This strange light was the first time this kind of strange light had appeared in the universe. In an instant, it was unknown how many false saints cast their gazes over from all over the universe. Among them, there were many false saints under the true saints, such as Hangu Zi and the others. When they saw the changes here clearly, and saw that it was actually Luo Fan and the false saints fighting here, there was an inexplicable flash of surprise in everyone's eyes. They were rather surprised that Luo Fan had not completed his mission after such a long time. On the contrary, he had created such a huge scene, causing the light formed from the collision of the true saint's mystique and the mystique that had never appeared in the universe before. However, they were only surprised for a while. Very soon, they retracted their gaze and no longer cared about what was happening here. When Luo Fan was able to preserve the true saint's mystique that he had fought, he had already become the strongest among the false saints. Such an existence had even more privileges. He would naturally do whatever he wanted to do and complete the mission how he wanted to complete it. It was not their turn to care. Since the disciples of the true saints were like this, the other false saints were obviously not calm. Everything that was happening in front of them had broadened their thinking and freed their minds that were originally restrained by the true saint's mystique. It allowed them to suddenly discover a brand new way to fight against the true saint's mystique. So this can be done. All of a sudden, the many false sages in the world that had yet to be attacked started to link up. They vaguely wanted to imitate the false sages that were fighting against Luo Fan and create a formation that could gather all of their strength to resist the incoming false sages. Of course, this time, they were not limited to the world that was about to face the same true saint. Instead, almost all the worlds that had yet to be attacked were connected. The wisdom of all the false saints were mixed together, and they began to work hard to stimulate their potential to create this formation together. There were a total of 42 false saints, 43 false saints, excluding the fact that Luo Fan was not a true saint's disciple, leaving 42 false saints. The false saints under the true saint attacked those worlds from all directions to collect the great Tao fragments inside the pseudo-primordial chaos spiritual treasure. This way, even if every false saint under the true saint only had one side of the world that had yet to attack, there were a total of 42 worlds. Not to mention that among these 42 true saints, there were at least 5 worlds that had yet to attack. As for those that had more, there were close to 20 worlds. In this way, there were a total of 500 to 600 worlds. At this moment, with so many worlds and so many false saints combined, the power was beyond imagination. In fact, it was much more terrifying than the combined power of the false saints under the true saint. There were so many false saints combined in so many worlds. Needless to say, their overall intelligence was high. It was almost as if a concept had just been proposed. A rough outline could be formed immediately, and the formation had vaguely taken shape. In addition, many false saints could adjust the flow of time in their own world. They could almost achieve billions of years in the blink of an eye. In this way, they wanted to create a formation that could combine the power of all the worlds and be used to resist the true saint's mystical ability. It was really as simple as eating a meal. It was created in almost the time it took to drink a cup of tea. For a moment, the false saints in the world were excited. It felt as if a small candle flame had finally been lit in the completely dark void. Although the light was extremely weak, it was no longer darkness. They finally saw some light. Of course, although they had created this formation, it did not mean that they had completed their work. Everything was fine, and they could truly resist the true saint's mystical ability. In fact, this was only the first step. The false saints were extremely intelligent. They were powerful and didn't need to be familiar with the general cooperation. They didn't need to train and just relied on their own deduction. They could cooperate with others extremely well, acting as if they had worked together for billions of years. However, that was only for general cooperation. This kind of formation that could resist the true saint's mystical ability. No matter from which angle, it was definitely not considered ordinary cooperation. The complexity of it was beyond everyone's imagination. The changes that any false saint needed to master were calculated in the trillions of changes. Every false saint needed to master so many changes. Among the many false saints, they had to combine each change with the other false saints to form the overall change that they needed. All in all, the changes would only be billions of times more complicated than the changes that any false saint could master. Under such circumstances, Even a false saint would need to train extremely hard and familiarize themselves with it countless times to be able to truly achieve perfect cooperation. Therefore, although the many false saints in the 500 to 600 worlds had already created this formation, they seemed to be even busier. Every single one of them was extremely nervous and cautiously communicated with the others. They worked hard to experiment, familiarize themselves with the various changes of the formation, and work hard to unleash the powerful power of this formation. Such a process, obviously, it would take a long time. Therefore, for a moment, those worlds only gathered together and did not launch a counterattack against the true Saint. Luo Fan naturally did not know that such a change would occur in those worlds. Although the false saint's sensing ability was beyond imagination, he still needed to have a purpose to sense it. At this moment, Luo Fan was most concerned about the battle with the 16 worlds in front of him. How could he care about the decisions of the other worlds? Around him, the power of the net of karma was unleashed more and more. It was engaged in an extremely intense and mysterious battle with the ever-changing power of erasure. It was a battle that contained endless mysteries. Although the changes of the erasure power under the control of the formation were only controlled by the many false saints, because of their extremely close cooperation and the fact that their overall intelligence was really beyond imagination, they were actually able to forcefully withstand the mysterious and incredible attacks that the karma net had evolved. Although it was not easy, originally, the distance between the 16 worlds and Luo Fan was already extremely far from the spatial dimension of the Earth's universe. The siege of the 16 worlds was like 16 suns besieging an ant. However, as time passed, the formation formed by the 16 worlds and the many pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures continued to expand, and the encirclement became larger and larger. From the outside, it looked like the physical sphere formed by the 16 worlds and the many pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures had become larger and larger due to the rapid change of position. The reason for such a change was very simple. Chapter 1522. Luo Fan naturally saw the various changes that occurred in the formation formed by the 16 worlds. The many false sages had relied on their own intelligence to create the aura of a true sage from a formation that was originally not at the true sage level. Luo Fan was secretly impressed when he saw this. However, this kind of admiration was just admiration. However, it was not enough for him to show mercy. He quietly sat cross-legged in the void and quietly watched the endless attacks emitted by the net of karma and the attacks emitted by the formation. He watched as the false sages exerted all their strength in the process and almost stimulated all their intelligence to resist these attacks. After all, the false sages were well prepared. Although it was a little difficult, they should still be able to hold on for a short period of time. Under the net of karma, the formation did not fall into a disadvantageous position. It actually formed a state of balance. Moreover, from the looks of it, this state of balance would continue for a very long time. Time passed slowly. In the blink of an eye, another 100 years passed. On this day, the remaining 500 to 600 worlds finally mastered the cooperation between the false sages and finally began to take action. In an instant, the 500 to 600 worlds vaguely formed a huge formation in the void. The thousands of pseudo-primordial origin spirit treasures stimulated their power one by one. The intense light faintly linked together, forming a giant and strange network between the infinite heavens, forming an incomparably special domain. Or rather, it was an extremely special world. The range of this domain was extremely vast, and it was unknown how many billions of sectors were surrounded within it. Vaguely, they formed the outline of a huge human figure. This human figure was so conspicuous in the void. It was so huge, and the intensity of the light it emitted was really earth-shattering. After the entire formation was formed, all the false sages instantly exerted their strength, and this human figure quickly charged towards Luo Fan. That's right, they were not charging towards the false sages under the other sages. They were not charging towards the target that they were going to deal with next, but towards something that had nothing to do with them. At the very least, their next target wasn't Luo Fan, who was charging towards them. Luo Fan was originally gradually gaining the upper hand in the battle against the formation formed by the 16 Worlds, gradually gaining victory. Suddenly, he felt an indescribable crisis. His heart skipped a beat. As soon as he sensed it, he immediately knew what was going on. He couldn't help but curse inwardly. Sure enough, he's looking for a soft target. Those false sages had clearly seen that the battle between him and the 16 Worlds had already entered the final stage. Seeing that he was being held up by the 16 Worlds, they felt that he was easy to bully. They felt that they had a greater chance of winning against him, so they directly set their target on him. The feeling of being targeted by thousands of false saints in all the worlds was naturally extremely uncomfortable for Luo Fan, but it was not that he could not understand it. After all, in the eyes of those false saints, Luo Fan and the false saints under the other saints were simply jackalls of the same tribe. He was also the greatest obstacle to their freedom. It was also one of the difficulties that they would encounter if they wanted to continue surviving. Therefore, to them, even if Luo Fan's next target wasn't any of them, to them, there was no difference between him and the false saints under the other saints. Since that was the case, they chose to fight against the 16 Worlds. Luo Fan, who seemed to be unable to divert his energy, was really normal. Of course, although he understood, Luo Fan didn't admit that he was a soft target. Seeing the 500 to 600 worlds forming a huge humanoid silhouette rushing towards him, his heart stirred. With a point of his finger, a karma net directly rushed out of his body, breaking through the battle circle formed by the karma net and the 16 Worlds. It directly shot towards the depths of the void, in the direction where the huge humanoid silhouette was rushing over. The battlefield was filled with boundless profound light, and it was filled with boundless and inconceivable energy impacts. Moreover, it contained countless profound profundities. Originally, if it was an ordinary true saint theurgy, even if it was released by the same person, it would be difficult for it to penetrate this battle circle. It would definitely be attacked by this battle circle and pulled into it. However, what Luo Fan had released was not an ordinary true saint theurgy. The karma net that he had released had already gone through several battles, and a large part of its potential had been stimulated. Moreover, its power was an absolutely restrained, true saint theurgy. The karma net in this state was not much different from an ordinary silk net. The power contained in it seemed to be completely non-existent. Under such circumstances, the karma net penetrated the battle circle. Of course, it was like something that didn't exist, and it wasn't intercepted by the battle circle at all. When the karma net left the battle circle, it also penetrated the formation formed by the 16 Worlds. After gathering, its power instantly erupted. It drew a long trajectory in the void and blasted towards the huge human silhouette in the distance. After completing this step, Luo Fan didn't stop there. Instead, he pointed again and another karma net was released by him. Similarly, its power was completely restrained, and it penetrated the battle circle without disturbing it. However, this time, the karma net didn't go far away. It didn't go towards the huge human silhouette formed by 500 or 600 worlds. Instead, it turned around and wrapped around the formation formed by the 16 worlds. After 100 years of development, the formation formed by the 16 worlds was more than 1,000,000 times larger than before. Compared to such a huge formation, the karma net was as small as an ant compared to the entire Milky Way. However, at this moment, the net of karma wrapped around the entire formation without leaving anything out. How is this possible? The false saint in the formation couldn't help but exclaim at this moment. The changes in front of them, it was far beyond their imagination. Over the past 100 years, although they had gradually fallen into a disadvantageous position in the battle against Luo Fan's karma net, they still exchanged blows after all. Between them, they could barely be considered to be on par with each other. Although they didn't have the delusion of completely defeating Luo Fan, they unknowingly felt that they would continue and be able to continue fighting with Luo Fan. Under such circumstances, Luo Fan suddenly did such an unbelievable thing. He could actually directly send his true saint remarkable power out of the formation and attack it instead. How could they not be shocked when they were attacked from the inside and outside with the karma net? However, after all, they were false saints, so they quickly figured it out. They were besieging Luo Fan, wanting to seize the slightest chance of victory from Luo Fan's hands. However, to this false saint under the true saint, he didn't care about them at all. During such a long period of time, he actually didn't use his full strength. Instead, he was using their power to temper his true saint remarkable power. After discovering this, the expressions of the many false saints changed drastically. I didn't expect that our efforts, which exhausted our intelligence, were actually used by the opponent to temper his own remarkable power. The false saint said with a bitter smile. At this moment, the power of the karma net that was attacking the formation from the outside skyrocketed. Endless mysterious lights and various attacks that emitted the aura of the true saint were blasted out. They had already directly bombarded the formation. Although the formation didn't only defend inwards, it didn't defend outwards. However, the power of the formation itself couldn't be as limitless as the true saint remarkable power. Since they had already placed most of their power on the battle with the karma net around Luo Fan, their defense against the outside world was naturally weak. At that moment, the entire formation suffered from the attacks. In just an instant, a crack appeared on one of the pseudo-primordial spiritual treasures that formed a part of the formation. Then, as if it was contagious, more and more cracks appeared on the pseudo-primordial spiritual treasures. Moreover, as time passed, these cracks increased in number and density. In the end, not long after, all the pseudo-primordial spiritual treasures looked as if they were pieced together from tiny fragments. Under such changes, the operation of the formation was naturally greatly affected. The entire formation, which had expanded to 1,000,000 times its original size, began to gradually shrink. Only in this way could they condense the power of the formation and achieve the goal of being able to defend against the impact of the karma net from both the inside and the outside. The more stable the original balance was, the faster it would collapse when it was out of balance. Previously, the offensive and defensive balance formed by the formation and Luo Fan's karma net had lasted for 100 years without collapsing. Now that the balance had been broken, the speed at which it collapsed was unimaginably fast. It was almost in the span of a few dozen breaths. The originally incomparably huge formation had been compressed to a state that was even smaller than when it had first appeared in front of Luo Fan. It had shrunk by more than 1,000,000 times. During the entire process, only the formation controlled by many false saints could shrink to this extent in such a short period of time without collapsing. Instead, it had condensed all the defenses to the extreme. When this defensive formation was condensed to such a degree, it was actually able to faintly withstand the bombardment of Luo Fan's and Luo Fan's webs of karma. It was like a turtle's shell, barely ensuring that the pseudo-primordial spirit treasures wouldn't completely collapse. It also ensured that their 16 worlds wouldn't be destroyed because of this. However, this was only temporary. The power of the two karma nets was simply too powerful and terrifying. If the formation was at the true saint level, it would be fine. It might really be able to hold on for a longer period of time. Since it was not a true saint-level formation, there was naturally no chance of turning the tables. This kind of failure was already irreparable for the two karma nets. Sure enough, it did not take long. In less than an hour, the two karma nets had already destroyed the formation in an instant. Boom, 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 boom. All the pseudo-primordial spiritual treasures in the formation collapsed in an instant. All the fragments of the great Tao within them were like exploding fireworks, flying wildly in all directions. At this moment, the terrifying power of the two karma nets directly pounced on the 16 worlds. They were going to completely destroy the 16 worlds. Seeing that the power of the karma net was about to bombard those worlds, Luo Fan was still unwilling to change his original decision. He raised his hand and pointed. The power of the two karma nets was restrained, and all the terrifying power that was originally bombarding the 16 worlds instantly disappeared as if it had never existed. Then, the two karma nets did not directly return to where he was. Instead, they quietly floated in the void, quietly looking at the 16 worlds. It seemed to be a warning, but also a precaution. This situation made the false saints in the 16 worlds feel a surge of joy as if they had come back to life. For a moment, the false saints had nothing else to say. Luo Fan did not care about them. Seeing that the 16 worlds were not going to kill him, he turned his hand. With a flip of his hand, a passageway that led straight to the Tao-containing void was constructed out of thin air. It began to madly devour the great Tao fragments that were like exploding flames, and it passed through all sorts of mysterious channels. It spread out and returned to the world that had been transformed by the true saints. It entered the Tao acceptance void above the great Tao. There were more than 100 false saints in the 16 worlds, and among them, there were more than 100 pseudo-primordial spiritual treasures. All the great Tao fragments were equivalent to more than 20 complete great Tao. At this moment, the unreserved devouring and teleportation seemed to be like a huge long river of the great Tao gushing out from the exit of the passage. It continuously poured into the great Tao of this world, and the scene seemed extremely grand and vast. Under Luo Fan's control, the devouring power of those passages on the great Tao fragments was beyond imagination. As a result, even though there were so many grand Taos, even though the grand Tao fragments were so scattered, they were completely absorbed by the passageway in just a few dozen breaths of time. Not a single grand Tao fragment remained. After doing all this, Luo Fan heaved a sigh of relief. With a wave of his hand, the passage instantly disappeared without a trace. It was as if it had never appeared. Why aren't you guys leaving? Could it be that you still want to get back at me? After doing all this, he looked at the 16 worlds that were quietly floating on the opposite side of the two karma nets and asked curiously. The false saint who often spoke paused for a moment before saying, "We don't dare to get back at you. However, we have some doubts in our hearts. I wonder if you could dispel them for us?" Luo Fan only smiled and said, "I wonder what doubts you have, fellow Taoist. I'm just puzzled. What benefits does collecting so many great Tao fragments bring to you?" The false saint said. When Luo Fan heard that, he smiled and said, "Benefits? If it's according to your standards, there are indeed no benefits. It can't make my cultivation improve by leaps and bounds, let alone turn the false into the real and break through the false saint stage to become a true saint. Then, according to your standards?" The false saint asked. His tone was still calm, but it was impossible to tell that they had fought to the death with Luo Fan in the past 100 years, nor could they tell that all their pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures had been completely destroyed by Luo Fan. "According to my standards, the benefits are not small. It can let me see the world that I want to see and understand the mysteries that I didn't understand before. That's enough." As expected of a true saint's disciple. Only a true saint's disciple can be so open-minded and carefree. The false saint sighed after a long time. "I'm not a true saint's disciple," Luo Fan said calmly. He naturally knew that this kind of explanation was absolutely useless. The mind of a false saint was firm and stubborn. Unless he really showed off his master and really showed evidence that he was not a disciple of a true saint, no false saint would believe his dry denial. However, although he knew that they would not believe him, Luo Fan had no choice but to deny it. This was because if he did not deny it, it would be a tacit agreement, and he would be pretending to be a true saint's disciple. Moreover, he would be pretending under the nose of a true saint. If a true saint was unhappy and crushed him, he would be dead. As expected, the false saint completely ignored Luo Fan's answer and did not have the mood to continue speaking. He immediately bade farewell to Luo Fan and controlled their 16 worlds to shoot into the depths of the void. At this moment, they were the same as the world that they had accused previously. The shape of the world that had turned into the Karma Seal was almost exactly the same. Luo Fan watched as they fled. He raised his hand, and the two karma webs fell into his hand. After all these years of fighting, his understanding of the karma webs, a true saint mystical ability, had improved greatly. At this moment, he could control these two karma webs as he pleased. At this moment, these two nets of karma seemed so tame. They even overlapped and lay quietly on his palm. If a false saint under the tutelage of another saint were to do this, they would definitely be courting death. For other false saints, even if these two true saint mystical abilities were unleashed by him, they would still overlap. They would definitely unleash all of their powers, and from there, a bitter battle that would not end until one side was dead. Only an existence like Luo Fan, who could control the true saint mystical ability to such a degree, could make these two true saint mystical abilities not interfere with each other. Even if they overlapped, they had nothing to do with each other. This was actually very normal. This could be seen from how Luo Fan was able to easily make the karma webs break away from the battle with the other true saint mystical abilities. If he couldn't completely restrain all the aura, power of the true saint mystical ability and not leak out at all, how could he escape the attacks of the other true saint mystical abilities? How could he completely cut off the connection with the aura of the other true saint mystical abilities? Holding these two true saint mystical abilities, Luo Fan turned around and faced another challenge that he had encountered. It was formed by 500 to 600 worlds. It looked like the outline of a huge human. This formation condensed the wisdom and power of thousands of false saints. Its power was powerful and terrifying. Even though Luo Fan had a great killing weapon like the karma webs, he didn't dare to underestimate it. At this moment, it had only been a few hours since he sensed the huge formation pouncing towards him. The huge formation had yet to reach its usual route. It was also a route above the space dimension of the Earth's universe. At this moment, the karma webs that Luo Fan had sent out had already intercepted its path. He quietly waited for the arrival of the huge human silhouette. Knowing that there wouldn't be a serious conflict for the time being, Luo Fan heaved a sigh of relief. He spread out his senses. He began to investigate the locations of the other 42 false saints who were in the same camp as him. When he saw all of this, he couldn't help but smile bitterly. At this moment, although Hungu Zi and the others were fighting with all their might, and their true saint innate abilities were quite powerful, they were all held back by the world they were facing and had fallen into a stalemate. Moreover, looking at the current situation of their battle, they shouldn't be able to break this stalemate in a short period of time. Should I be happy or angry? Luo Fan thought to himself, and the smile on his face became even more bitter. Originally, he had only planned to be a bystander and even collect false saints as the final sacrifice. However, he didn't expect that he would become the main force now and face the strongest resistance of the many false saints. How could he feel at ease? He even suspected that Hungu Zi and the others had such a plan. That was why they were held back in those worlds and fell into a stalemate with their targets. Of course, this was just a thought. Luo Fan's eyesight was so powerful that he could tell at a glance that they had already done their best. However, they needed to increase the power of their true saint mystical abilities step by step. In this way, it would naturally take an extremely long time. How could they compare to Luo Fan, who could preserve the power of the true saint mystical abilities again and again? The time it took was naturally much longer than Luo Fan's. While smiling bitterly, Luo Fan took a step forward and used his karma net as his target. In the blink of an eye, he had already arrived at the place where he had sent out the karma net previously. When he arrived, he made a grabbing motion, and the karma net was once again caught in his hand. It was stacked together with the two karma nets that had already been stacked together in his hand. In an instant, the karma net in his hand seemed to have become thicker. The 3 karma nets quietly stayed in his hand. They didn't look like true saint mystical abilities at all. In fact, there was nothing special about them at all. They were completely like ordinary silk nets. Luo Fan played with the karma net while quietly waiting for the humanoid silhouette to arrive. Chapter 1523. I didn't expect that you guys would still dare to target me after noticing that I've already freed my hands. Luo Fan looked at the huge humanoid silhouette that was getting closer and closer and said with a faint smile on his face. His words penetrated the void and entered the huge human silhouette. It rang in the ears of every pseudo-saint in every corner of the world. "It's just that we can't back down now," one of the pseudo-saints said. His voice also easily penetrated all obstacles and entered Luo Fan's ears. "I didn't expect you to be so powerful. Even those 200 fellow Taoists couldn't hold you back for a few hours," another pseudo-saint said at this moment. "Perhaps they're not strong enough?" Luo Fan smiled faintly. At this moment, the huge humanoid silhouette had already raised its hand and slapped down at Luo Fan. This palm contained an unimaginable amount of power. It felt as though the power of hundreds of true divine powers were contained in it. It was as though the entire earth and universe would collapse and be completely destroyed under this palm. Facing such a palm, Luo Fan frowned. He did not dare to be negligent. He raised his hand, and the 3 true Saint Theurgies in his hand instantly soared into the sky, meeting the palm. This time, he did not dare to use a true Saint Theurgy to block the palm. Instead, he directly sent out his 3 karma webs at the same time, combining the power of the 3 karma webs to block the palm. The 3 karma webs contained some kind of true saint spiritual intelligence. Naturally, they knew how critical the situation was at this moment and how dangerous it was for them to be hit by that palm. As soon as they were raised, they already had everything they had. The terrifying power that had been accumulated through countless battles was completely unleashed. Endless spiritual light soared into the sky from the 3 karma webs and began to combine in midair. It directly formed a palm that was not inferior to the palm of the humanoid silhouette above, directly meeting the palm of the humanoid silhouette. Boom, 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 boom. A shockwave that was strong enough to shake the heavens, and myriad worlds began to spread out in all directions from the point of contact. Under this terrifying shock, Luo Fan even felt that the entire Earth's universe seemed to have a reaction at this moment. Even the originally transcendent universe seemed to have reacted at this moment. At this moment, the demon realm also seemed to be shaking because of this fluctuation. It was also enveloped by this terrifying roar. At this moment, the entire palm of the human silhouette seemed to have suffered an incredible counterattack. The entire palm rolled back as if it couldn't withstand the rebound force. However, it was clearly not an ordinary giant made of flesh and blood. Instead, it was the image of a huge formation formed by 500 or 600 worlds. All the changes were due to the changes in the formation. All the changes were due to the changes in the formation. At this moment, under the natural operation of the formation, the palm of the human silhouette drew a mysterious trajectory in the void. It directly blasted down in an even more terrifying and shocking manner than before, blasting into the terrifying shockwave produced by the previous collision, although this shockwave was just an invisible shockwave. However, because it was too terrifying, it had already formed a world of infinite fluctuations. At this moment, it had completely covered the scene of the collision. It also covered the palm formed by the power of the true sage level that was released by the 3 karma webs. 3 aren't enough. At this moment, Luo Fan clearly felt the changes in his 3 karma webs, and such a thought flashed across his mind. One must know that among all the false saints he knew, apart from himself, no one could combine the power of 3 true sage theurgies to fight against an enemy. The power that had erupted was not as simple as 1 + 1. It wasn't as simple as 1 + 1. Instead, it was an increase of several times. The overall power was more than 100 times stronger than a single true sage theurgy. However, at this moment, such power could not withstand the attack of a formation that was not at the true sage level. At this moment, the power released by the 3 karma webs had been completely crushed, causing the 3 karma webs to wait for the attack of the huge palm of the human silhouette without any cover. One could imagine how shocking this was to Luo Fan. However, fortunately, Luo Fan was not a false saint under other true saints. He was a powerful existence that could control multiple true sage theurgies at the same time and make them attack together. When he realized that 3 true sage theurgies were not enough, he did not hold back anymore. He directly mobilized the remaining 20 karma webs between the infinite worlds in his body and sent them out without holding back. These 20 karma webs were all true sage theurgies that had been stimulated through several battles. They were tens of thousands of times more powerful than the karma webs that had just been born. Now that they appeared together, the scene was shocking. Even Luo Fan could not help but feel an inexplicable sense of satisfaction when he saw it. After these 20 karma webs were sent out, they merged together based on their battle instincts without waiting for Luo Fan to control them. Moreover, this kind of combination was not like the combination of the 3 nets of karma from before, where the power of the 3 nets of karma overlapped and complemented each other. Instead, it was a complete and genuine combination. In other words, after the 20 over karma webs combined, they had completely lost their original number of over 20. Instead, they turned into a karma web that was over 20 times larger and tens of thousands of times more powerful than before. This kind of combination was beyond Luo Fan's expectations. He only came back to his senses after the 20 over karma webs were completely combined, and he felt indescribable joy. I didn't expect to get such a blessing in disguise and cause such a change in the karma webs, he thought to himself, and wore a faint smile on his face. When comparing dispersed power and concentrated power, of course, concentrated power would bring more benefits. It was like comparing 100 people carrying a table with one person carrying 100 tables by himself, each of the 100 people carrying a table. This gave people the feeling that it was very normal. At most, people would guess that they wanted to organize a special gathering and set up a venue. However, when one person carried 100 tables, it gave people the feeling that it was like the arrival of Superman. By the same logic, over 20 karma webs and a single karma web that absorbed the power of over 20 karma webs were obviously 2 completely different concepts. This could be seen from the increase in its power. The reason for such a change was very simple. It was because these karma webs had the battle intelligence of a true sage. This battle intelligence, it allowed them to think from the perspective of a true sage and control the battle. With such battle intelligence, these karma webs naturally knew the situation in front of them as soon as they appeared. They understood the result of the battle when the 3 karma webs were not completely combined. Therefore, their battle intelligence naturally urged them to choose a better method and form a closer combination with the other karma webs, in order to condense a stronger and more terrifying power to fight against the enemy. The speed of these karma webs seemed to surpass time. In a flash, they had already arrived at the place where the 3 karma webs were and fused with the other 3 karma webs. At this moment, the many karma webs that Luo Fan had previously sent out were completely replaced by super karma webs that were tens of thousands of times more powerful than the original one. The power of all the karma webs had been condensed into one. At this moment, this super karma webs suddenly exploded with earth-shattering power. Endless mysterious light burst out from its body and condensed into all kinds of unbelievable scenes in the void, forming all kinds of attacks that seemed to surpass all heaven and earth. They suddenly blasted towards the giant human-shaped palm. At this moment, the palm of the human-shaped silhouette also happened to arrive. As soon as the 2 came into contact, the entire human-shaped silhouette began to shake violently. The many false sages in the human-shaped silhouette let out muffled groans almost at the same time, as if a terrifying pain had suddenly befallen them. Immediately after, the human-shaped silhouette suddenly collapsed. Its entire body instantly doubled in size, and the thousands of pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures that were flickering at high speed instantly flickered at an even faster speed. This appearance, it was obvious that the huge array could only increase its scale at this time and expand its volume to obtain more space to move. It had already achieved the effect of allowing its power to be better used to resist the impact of the super karma webs. However, even so, the attack launched by the super karma webs still could not resist the palm of the giant human-shaped silhouette. It was completely crushed by the palm, causing the super karma webs to appear under the palm without any cover. Fortunately, this was a super karma webs after all. The combat intelligence of the true sage stage had already reached an unimaginable level. In the blink of an eye, the true sage stage karma webs had already undergone changes again, and more mysterious changes were constantly displayed from the karma webs. Endless mysterious light shone within it, and the karma webs suddenly expanded by hundreds of millions of times. In the blink of an eye, it had completely enveloped the entire human-shaped silhouette, forming a huge circle. Then, the huge circular karma webs shone with mysterious light, and endless mysterious power directly blasted in all directions of the human-shaped silhouette. Of course, this kind of bombardment was not just a simple collision of power. It also contained all kinds of extremely mysterious mysteries that ordinary false sages could not understand. If an ordinary true divine ability were to face any one of these mysteries, they would not be able to escape unscathed. The core of the true divine ability would be crushed and completely destroyed. Such a terrifying bombardment was directly aimed at the huge formation that had transformed into the human-shaped silhouette. One could imagine how much pressure it brought to the many false sages within it. The tacit understanding that they had trained for 100 years was reflected at this moment. Almost at the same time as the bombardment of the karma webs erupted, the entire huge human-shaped silhouette had already turned into another form. A form that looked like a huge machete. In this form, the machete suddenly lifted up and slashed towards the karma webs in a manner that seemed to be able to split heaven and earth. The power of this lift, it even cut through the void, and one could faintly see a grayish existence appearing behind the severed void. Luo Fan was shocked when he saw this. This was because he knew very well that the gray existence was none other than the chaotic state. There was no discount at all. There was no false chaotic state at all. However, this place was a void. It was a barrier that isolated the chaotic state. Therefore, even though it was cut and the existence of the chaotic state was revealed, the chaotic state still did not surge in here. It still lingered outside the crack, quietly waiting for the crack to disappear, to be able to slash into the state of primal chaos. It was enough to show that the cleaver's ability to split the heavens and earth was not just a description. Perhaps it could really cut open the state of primal chaos and open up a new world. The combined force of thousands of false sages is actually so powerful. Upon discovering this, Luo Fan could not help but sigh. At this moment, the machete instantly destroyed the endless mysterious attack that the karma webs had unleashed. The attack from the karma webs was powerful and mysterious. Of course, it was something that the changes of the machete itself could not compare to. However, the attack of the machete was too powerful and terrifying. It did not care about any changes at all. It relied on a terrifying attack to crush him. In this way, how could he really withstand it? After the machete shattered all the attacks of the karma webs, it directly locked onto the main body of the karma webs and wanted to shatter the karma webs. However, how could things be so simple? The karma webs contain the combat intelligence of a true sage. Its ability to grasp flaws was not something that any false sage could compare to. In the instant that the machete completely shattered its attack, a cold glint flashed across its eyes. Its second wave of attack had already been condensed. However, this time, it was not aimed at the front of the machete's attack. Instead, it directly targeted the body of the machete other than the front, where it did not have much attack power at all. The endless mysterious light condensed into countless worlds, forming countless attacks that could easily shatter a false sage and instantly destroy a true sage's mystical ability. In the blink of an eye, it had already arrived on the machete's main body. At this moment, the machete transformed once again, instantly turning into a giant hammer. With a sudden shake, It once again shattered the countless attacks of the karma webs. Then it once again crushed the main body of the karma webs. The crushing of this giant hammer had an aura that could destroy heaven and earth. As it crushed down, the void distorted, and a terrifying, chaotic state also appeared. It also lingered outside the crack that had appeared, quietly waiting for the crack to close. The power of such a terrifying attack could be imagined. I didn't expect it to use a completely different method from the previous 16 worlds. Luo Fan frowned at this moment. Although the array formed by the 16 worlds that he had encountered previously could also fight against his karma webs, it completely relied on the wisdom of many false sages to forcibly simulate the changes of a true sage's mystical ability. With changes against changes, it disintegrated every bit of power that the karma webs emitted, thus achieving the result of resisting the attack of the karma webs. However, the array formed by the 500 to 600 worlds in front of him used a completely different method. They did not compete with a true sage's mystical ability in terms of changes. Instead, they completely abandoned all mysterious changes and used pure strength to win. No matter what kind of attack the true sage's mystical ability produced, or what kind of changes it produced, they just crushed the attack that exceeded the endurance of the karma webs, no matter how mysterious the attack was. In contrast, this method of dealing with it was obviously taking advantage of the many worlds. The overall strength of the many false sages was far stronger than that of a true sage's mystical ability and was far stronger than that of a true sage's disciples. They tried their best to avoid the disadvantage of their combat intelligence being inferior to that of a true sage's mystical ability. Obviously, this was a smart choice to play to their strengths and avoid their weaknesses. However, even so, Luo Fan was not worried. When the net of karma didn't shatter the first moment and was completely destroyed, he knew that the result was already certain. The true sage-level combat intelligence contained in the karma webs was enough to allow the karma webs to make corresponding adjustments according to the situation during the battle, allowing the potential of the karma webs to be continuously stimulated. In the end, even if the opponent won by relying on strength, by relying on a tough method that ignored all the mysterious attacks of the opponent, the karma webs would definitely be able to find a way to deal with it. In the end, obtain the final victory. The opponent's choice and methods were different. The only thing that affected was the time that the karma webs obtained victory. Luo Fan floated quietly in the void, his eyes fixed on the battle between the karma webs and the array formed by hundreds of worlds in front of him. Countless thoughts flashed through his mind, all kinds of mysteries of the karma webs. They kept flashing and lingering in his heart. All the attacks that the karma webs had sent out. He used his heart to comprehend all the choices that he made and tried his best to simulate them in his heart. The comprehension of the true sage mystique was a shortcut to get close to the true sage level. This was also the only way for a false sage to come into contact with the power of a true sage. For anyone who wanted to become a true sage, it was necessary to comprehend the mysteries of the true sage mystique. At this moment, although Luo Fan's net of karma had suffered great trouble and was fighting in a difficult situation against an opponent that was almost completely unreasonable, he was still in a difficult situation. However, it was also because of such a huge problem and such a pathetic battle that the karma webs underwent various changes. More and more ways of operating were displayed. This brought him great convenience in comprehending the mysteries of the karma webs. This was just like how, if one wanted to know a person's strength in a certain aspect, the best way was to test them in an environment that was extremely difficult for them to understand the mysteries of the true sage mystique. Of course, the best way was to let the true sage mystique encounter trouble and then understand it by solving all kinds of troubles. Luo Fan carefully comprehended the changes of the true sage mystique and had a better understanding of the ability of the super karma webs formed by more than 20 true sage mystiques. He also gradually grasped the various changes that occurred when they were fused together. The fusion of more than 20 karma webs produced an earth-shattering change. At this moment, if this super karma webs were to face any of the 20 karma webs that he had previously. However, they would definitely be able to win the moment they came into contact and completely crush the original karma webs. Even his own karma webs were the same. To the other false sages under true sages, the advantage would be even more obvious. In other words, at this moment, Luo Fan had truly achieved absolute invincibility among all the false sages that he knew. After suddenly realizing this, an inexplicable expression suddenly appeared on Luo Fan's face. I didn't expect that I would actually reach this step unknowingly. As he thought of this, his gaze suddenly became a little distant. The battle between the super karma webs and the huge formation continued. Due to the fact that the karma webs were at a disadvantage, they could only continuously stimulate their own potential and continuously launch all kinds of strange attacks. They tried their best to search for the many weaknesses of the huge formation and looked for a way to break through the formation and crush it with absolute attacks. Even though the formation used absolute offense to crush the opponent and crush all attacks from the net of karma, there were definitely quite a few variations to it as well. However, most of the changes were targeted at the size and shape of the formation, as well as the crushing attacks they chose. As for the attack of the net of karma, it was still a forceful suppression, an unreasonable suppression. As time passed, the operation of the formation became smoother and smoother, and the various changes became more and more spontaneous. In the void, there was actually a different kind of mystery and beauty. At the same time, although the karma net appeared to be in a sorry state, it gradually found some methods as time passed. Although its attacks were still being continuously suppressed, it was able to last longer and longer. The attacks aimed at the weak points of the karma net also became more and more accurate. The threat it posed to the karma net also became stronger and stronger. And all of this was seen by Luo Fan and the many false sages in the formation. Chapter 1524. Time passed slowly. Unknowingly, several years had passed. Over the past few years, the net of karma had gained an increasing upper hand in the battle against the formation. The changes in the formation vaguely gave off a feeling that it was running for its life. Although he was still using great power to crush all techniques, his weaknesses were increasingly being discovered by the web of karma. More and more mysterious attacks were being unleashed by the web of karma to target him. I didn't expect it to be here. Looks like the saying, "a tall tree attracts the wind," does make sense. At this moment, a voice suddenly rang out in Luo Fan's ears. This voice was extremely familiar to Luo Fan. It was Han Guzi's voice. Luo Fan's heart shook. He turned his head to look at the source of the voice, only to see a figure slowly appearing a few feet away from him. That person was Han Guzi. Luo Fan sighed and said, "I didn't expect that fellow Taoist would be the first to come and help." Compared to the last time Luo Fan met him, Han Guzi's aura and the power around him had undergone an indescribable change. There seemed to be some kind of baleful aura around him. These changes were obviously caused by him killing many false sages over the years. This kind of murderous aura was actually not some kind of energy that truly existed. Instead, it was just a natural change in temperament that was formed after one's mind naturally changed due to certain encounters and certain experiences. But it would not be born as long as there was slaughter. Instead, this kind of baleful aura would only be born when one had to slaughter one's soul. At this moment, Han Guzi's heart sank. Clearly, only killing a false saint could bring such an impact to his heart and bring about such a change. Support? You don't need my support at all. Only now do I realize that fellow Taoist is actually much more powerful than me. In comparison, fellow Taoist seems more like a disciple of a sage. We're more like loose cultivators. Han Guzi sighed. Luo Fan only smiled faintly and said, "I only gained a little. How could it be compared to the means of the true sage sect? However, if fellow Taoist doesn't provide assistance and waits for me to face them like this, it might take several hundred years to defeat them. This was a huge waste of time. I hope fellow Taoist is mentally prepared. It's only a few hundred years. I'm sure any fellow Taoist can afford to wait that long." Han Guzi replied in a nonchalant manner. Hearing this, Luo Fan could only sigh. He's really invincible. Hunguzi looked at the battlefield for a while and let out a long sigh. He was obviously referring to Luo Fan's web of karma. He had a deep understanding of the true divine god's powers. Hence, he could tell at a glance that the karma web was many times stronger than an ordinary true divine god's powers. He could clearly feel that his true sage, supernormal ability had no ability to resist the karma web at all. It would definitely be torn apart by the karma web immediately. In other words, if Luo Fan wanted to deal with him, he had no means to resist. Knowing this, Hunguzi naturally felt an inexplicable sense of loss. This was the pride of being a disciple of a true sage. It made him feel extremely repulsed by the feeling that his strength was completely suppressed by others. However, his rationality told him that this was a fact that he could not change at all. However, Luo Fan did not answer him. His expression was calm and indifferent. Hunguzi did not expect an answer from him. At this moment, he also sat cross-legged in the void like Luo Fan. He began to quietly comprehend the various mysteries revealed by the battle between the karma web and the huge formation. After witnessing the extent to which Luo Fan's strength had increased after mastering his true divine god's powers, his desire to master his own true divine god's powers was naturally unprecedentedly strong. How could he miss this opportunity to comprehend the mysteries of the true divine god's powers? As Hunguzi no longer spoke, the scene returned to its previous violent but calm state. The arrival of Hunguzi was like rubbing salt on the wounds of the many false sages in the huge formation. At this moment, all of them felt an indescribable sense of despair. It must be known that although they felt extremely pressured when facing Luo Fan, they were still barely on par with Luo Fan after all. They still had a trace of hope in their hearts that they could go against the heavens and win. However, now that another true sage disciple had appeared, another false sage who had mastered the true divine god's powers had appeared. To them, this had obviously extinguished the trace of hope that they originally had. In this despair, they began to activate the formation they had set up without any scruples. During this process, the entire formation actually changed faster and faster. As it changed, many flaws were actually eliminated. It actually stimulated the potential of the formation, causing the power of the formation to become even greater. Such a change caused the pressure on the net of karma to suddenly increase greatly. They could vaguely feel that the net of karma had suffered an even greater impact during this process. The upper hand that they had gradually gained was actually lost unknowingly. However, this situation did not make Luo Fan and Hunguzi worry at all. On the contrary, their eyes lit up slightly at this moment. The stronger the resistance, the more changes the net of karma would stimulate. The profoundness of the true divine level that the net of karma displayed would also become richer. To Luo Fan and Hunguzi, who were wholeheartedly comprehending the profoundness of the true divine level, this was obviously great news. Hunguzi's standard was probably only average among the many false sages under the true sage disciples. During this period of time, he was able to defeat his opponents and come here. The other false sages under the true sage disciples were no exception. However, in the following period of time, they also ended their respective battles one after another and came here one after another, appearing beside Luo Fan and Hunguzi. Their performance was also similar to Hunguzi's. After praising Luo Fan, they directly sat cross-legged in the void and began to quietly comprehend the various profoundness of the true divine level that the net of karma revealed in the process of fighting the formation. This kind of performance was natural. Fortunately, Luo Fan's will was firm and unshakable. Otherwise, he would definitely be so angry that he would vomit blood. They clearly treated this as a teaching battle, completely ignoring the fact that this battle was supposed to be fought by them. Just like that, 100 years passed in the blink of an eye. After 100 years, all the 42 false sages who were on the same side as Luo Fan had arrived. All the false sages under the true sage disciples had already arrived and appeared beside Luo Fan. Each of them sat cross-legged and looked at the net of karma that was torturing the huge formation with an intoxicated and inquiring expression. That's right, at this moment, the net of karma was already torturing the huge formation formed by 500 to 600 worlds. After 100 years, this huge formation had already been completely grasped by the net of karma. The pattern of its changes had been completely grasped by the net of karma. Once all the changes caused by the many false saints controlling the formation appeared, they would be blocked by the attack from the net of karma. Even their weaknesses would be instantly grasped, and they would have no choice but to run for their lives to change their changes to block that kind of attack. In this way, how could they still be in the state where they completely ignored any changes in the net of karma and only relied on their powerful attacks to crush the formation? As for the size of the entire formation, now, it had been compressed to less than 1/10,000th of its original size. Vaguely, it seemed to be a little more crowded than before. It felt like the thousands of pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures were unable to move freely. I wonder if everyone is willing to give up now. Sensing that the net of karma had already completely determined its victory and that the entire formation could be completely destroyed at any time, Luo Fan spoke. This voice was transmitted directly into the ears of the thousands of false sages in the 500 to 600 square meters in the entire formation, allowing them to hear this calm voice in an instant. Hearing this voice, the expressions of the many false sages changed slightly. How could they not see the situation at this moment? How could they not know that their failure was already right in front of them? The reason why they were unwilling to give up was only because of the anger in their hearts. Now that Luo Fan had pointed it out, it felt as if that anger had been sucked away in an instant. It suddenly made them feel that their persistence over the years seemed to have become meaningless. However, a false sage was a false sage after all. In the silence, a false sage said what all the false sages were thinking. Give up? No. Since we are false sages, how can we give up halfway? Stubborn. Luo Fan could only sigh slightly when he saw this. He did not have much hope in the first place. The reason why he said that was just a sudden impulse. It was unknown if it was a coincidence or something else, but after this conversation, the net of karma finally grasped the weakness of the formation in an attack. It inserted the endless true sage aura that was powerful enough to completely destroy all true sage mystical abilities into a certain point of the formation. With a sweep, it swept through the entire 500 to 600 worlds and thousands of pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures. This power was directly used inside the formation, but it completely bypassed the defensive ability of the formation and directly acted on the bodies of the many pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures. In an instant, crack, 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 crack. Countless crisp sounds came from the formation and instantly entered the ears of Luo Fan and the other false sages, causing their expressions to change accordingly. On Luo Fan's side, a smile appeared on their faces. They seemed rather excited and happy. On the other side, the many false sages in the formation looked as if they had lost their parents. Every single one of their eyes was filled with despair. Immediately after, the entire formation suddenly stopped. All the pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures were completely enveloped by tiny cracks. Moreover, these cracks became larger, denser, and more obvious as time passed. In the end, in the blink of an eye, all the pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures exploded. It was as if dense fireworks had suddenly exploded, causing the entire formation to become so gorgeous. Those that exploded the pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures were obviously the great Tao fragments. Luo Fan, who had already experienced it once, did not hesitate at this time. With a wave of his hand, thousands of passages leading to the Tao containment void appeared out of thin air. They directly connected to the net of karma and arrived at the great Tao fragments that exploded from every pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasure. They began to frantically devour these great Tao fragments. Through the channel, the fragments of the great Tao were continuously transmitted to the heaven and earth beyond the range of the Earth's cosmic space dimension. Fortunately, The entire formation was wrapped by the net of karma. Although the great Tao fragments exploded in it, they did not break through the barrier of the net of karma and spread out. Instead, they kept colliding, lingering, crushing, and intertwining in the void inside the net of karma. This made it extremely easy for Luo Fan to construct the passage and devour the great Tao fragments at this time. He did not need to search for the great Tao fragments everywhere. As long as the passageway was placed there, all the fragments of the great Tao would naturally be swallowed by it and would naturally be transmitted back. It's finally done. Many false sages under the true sage's tutelage praised it this time. They couldn't help but reveal disappointed and joyful smiles on their faces. They were disappointed. It was naturally because the process of comprehending the mysteries of the true sage's remarkable ability that was many times more powerful than theirs had ended. It would be difficult to find the same opportunity again. The joy was even simpler. It was because the plan that they had painstakingly planned for hundreds of years was about to succeed. Very soon, all the great Tao fragments were completely devoured by the passage and transferred into the void of Tao concealing space. Although there were thousands of pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures, all the great Tao fragments they contained were only equivalent to more than 600 complete great Tao. However, they did not reach the point of thousands of complete great Tao. This, coupled with the results of the previous efforts of Han Guzi and the others, added up. The number of complete great Taos in the Tao containment void had reached over 1,200 great Taos. In other words, the patterns on the surface of the Tao containment void had already reached more than 1,200. There were already more than 1,200 of them, and they were densely packed together. They looked very strange and mysterious, causing people to naturally feel an inexplicable sense of emotion when they saw them. After collecting all the great Tao fragments, Luo Fan turned around without hesitation and walked away. He directly left this void. Han Guzi and the others did the same thing. They also did the same thing. They did not care about the 500 to 600 square worlds that had lost their pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures. They directly turned around and left this void, heading toward the world where the Tao containment void was. This situation made the false sages in the 500 to 600 square worlds unable to react for a moment. What's going on? Didn't they say that the world would be destroyed and the false sages would be captured before they were willing to stop? A false sage said in surprise. Of course, as said countless times in the past, a false sage was, after all, a false sage. Very soon, a false sage thought of the reason. It seems that the number of false sages they collected is enough. If we had known this earlier, we wouldn't have been so desperate before. Another false sage sighed. These false sages did not disperse at this time. They still vaguely maintained the appearance of the formation. Although he had lost so many pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures, and the array he had constructed was incomparable to before, there were still 500 to 600 square meters of heaven and earth. The power of the array he had constructed with these heaven and earth wasn't small. At the very least, it was more than 10 times stronger than the formation formed by the 16 worlds that Luo Fan had encountered at the beginning. Facing the divine ability of an ordinary true sage, it could already hold on for a long time. Although these false sages had roughly confirmed that Luo Fan and the others would not attack them anymore. They had just been attacked for more than 100 years and had even lost their most important pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures. How could they completely relax now? Of course, there was still an inexplicable uneasiness in their hearts. Actually, just as these false sages had guessed, Han Guzi and the others no longer needed to collect false sages. There was no other reason than that Han Guzi and the others had already collected 1,000 false sages from other places as sacrifices. The thousands of false sages here were no longer of any use to them. 500 to 600 square worlds were floating here. The thousands of false sages among them communicated with each other and decided to temporarily gather together to form a formation to leave this place. Therefore, very soon, The formation formed by the 5 to 600 square worlds turned into a huge human silhouette. It began to walk towards the depths of the void step by step, seemingly slow but actually fast. Not to mention that these false sages hurriedly fled. At this moment, Luo Fan and the others had already arrived at the world that had been transformed by the true sage. At this moment, all of them had strange expressions on their faces. However, none of them expected that hundreds of years after they left, this world would actually become like this. At this moment, the number of false sages in this world had already increased by several times compared to when they left. Moreover, the newly added false saints had completely integrated with the world in front of them that originally did not have a real great Tao, completely stabilizing this world. As a result, these false saints did not seem to be able to do as they pleased in this world as they did in the past. Instead, they seemed to be shackled by some kind of inexplicable shackles. They actually took revenge on us like this. Hunguzi sighed. However, he could see the result of this change and the reason for it at a glance. For a moment, however, he felt extremely helpless in his heart. Fellow Taoists, aren't you looking for trouble for yourselves? So, you guys are only opposing our actions because you don't want us to collect great Tao fragments. It shouldn't be because you don't want that world to be born, right? Since that's the case, why create such an obstacle? Hunguzi sighed. It's just anger. I think fellow Taoists should be able to understand, right? At this moment, Jean Chanzi said indifferently. Anger. Hunguzi and the others smiled bitterly. Although the false sages were extremely intelligent and had a firm will, their control over their emotions had reached the acme of perfection. However, this did not mean that they did not have 7 emotions and 6 desires, and they did not have anger or hatred. If the false sages did not want to control their emotions, these emotions would still be no different from ordinary cultivators and mortals. It would also cause them to do all sorts of foolish things that would normally seem extremely foolish. Right now, Jean Chanzi and the others clearly did not want to control the anger in their hearts at all, allowing their anger to push them to do things that were not beneficial to either of them. Toward such a method, although they felt helpless, they could not blame them. In the end, they could only sigh helplessly. It's a pity for this world. Such a thought flashed through everyone's mind. Since this world had already become like this and could no longer be modified, Hunguzi and the others naturally would not continue to delay here. Immediately, the 40 false sages used their own abilities and summoned the great Tao in the unseen world again. It appeared in the void. Then, everyone attacked at the same time. The Tao concealing void that was originally hidden in the great Tao was slowly separated from the great Tao, turning into a black sphere that floated in the void again. Compared to when it was first born, the Tao containment void now had over 1,200 densely packed runes. This meant that there were more than 1,200 great Taos contained within. After grabbing the Tao concealing void, they no longer restricted the great Tao. With a slight tremble, the great Tao shrank back into the unseen world and hid in an invisible place again. Perhaps because the Tao concealing void was no longer being suppressed, the entire world seemed to tremble slightly at this moment, and there seemed to be an inexplicable sense of relaxation. The false sages that were born in this world could sense it even more clearly. All of them could clearly feel that some kind of shackles that were originally restricting their comprehension of the great Tao of heaven and earth seemed to have disappeared. Their cultivation realm, that had not changed at all for the past hundreds of years, actually seemed to have loosened slightly. This kind of feeling caused their emotions to involuntarily become complicated. Although they were projections that relied on the projection of the great Tao to become false sages, they were still true false sages. Their intelligence was not inferior to that of Hunguzi and the others at all. After hundreds of years of understanding and research, they also knew the reason why they were able to be born. They also understood what the world would become if they did not stop it. As for the source of all these changes, he was very clear about it. How could they not know that this feeling appeared at this moment? This was because the source of the changes in the world had probably broken away from the great Tao, causing the world to finally lose that inexplicable change. This was undoubtedly a good thing for them. It allowed them to still be false sages and still be immortal in this world. They were omniscient, omnipotent, and omnipotent. However, to the world, it meant that they had lost the opportunity to turn from a projection into a real world. This was obviously a terrible thing. Chapter 1525. Luo Fan and the others naturally did not care about the mentality of these false saints born in the world. At this moment, they controlled the Tao concealment void together and left that world without any hesitation, appearing in the void outside the world. Since that world could no longer be transformed into a brand new world by them, they naturally would not delay in that world any longer. It's finally about to begin. Luo Fan looked at the false saints under the 42 sages around him, and then looked at the Tao concealment void in front of him. He could not help but have this thought flash through his mind. When he first met Hanguzi, his heart was filled with worry. He was extremely uneasy about how to protect his divine court heavenly cauldron and the great Tao fragments that he had painstakingly obtained from the false saints under the sages. In the end, he even had to ask Hanguzi to give him a promise. But now, he had become the strongest among the many false saints. Not to mention the fact that the other sages no longer had the ability to deal with him, even if he wanted to snatch away the Tao concealment void in front of him and snatch all the great Tao fragments in it. They probably would not be able to resist. This change in status was really like the changing of the wind and clouds, making him feel a little emotional for a moment. Any false saint had thousands of ways to open up a world. The methods of the sages in front of him would only be more wonderful and powerful. Therefore, at this moment, they were thinking about how to extract the great Tao and the Tao concealment void in front of them and open up that shocking world. They did not have any doubts at all. As for how to sacrifice the false sages that they had captured and turn them into the final stimulation for the formation of this world, they were all very clear about it. Therefore, at this moment, they were floating here, but there was no need for any words or discussions at all. Every pseudo-sage knew clearly what they needed to do at this moment and what their next mission was. Not to mention them, even Luo Fan was quite clear at this moment. Moreover, compared to the false saints under the other true saints, Luo Fan's task was more arduous. There were more things that he needed to be responsible for. Of course, this was not because the other false saints forcefully ordered Luo Fan around like a coolie. In fact, opening up a world was completely different from other things. The more other things were done, the more tiring it would be. The more they suffered, the more they suffered. However, opening up heaven and earth was completely different. The more you did to open up heaven and earth, the greater your contribution to heaven and earth. After the heaven and earth is completely established, your authority in the heaven and earth will be higher, and the heaven and earth will be closer to you. Therefore, the more he did in the process of opening up the world, the better it would be. The reason why Luo Fan could be assigned to do the most work at this time was because he had to do so many things. It was because in the process of collecting more than 1,200 great Daos, Luo Fan had contributed the most. This made the false saints under the other true saints have no choice but to hand these tasks to Luo Fan. Seeing that everyone was ready, Luo Fan no longer hesitated. He pointed at the Tao concealing void in front of him. In an instant, the Tao concealing void expanded and collapsed. In the blink of an eye, the entire Tao concealing void had disappeared without a trace. The countless fragments of the great Tao that existed within it appeared like fireworks in front of everyone. Although there were more than 1,200 patterns in the Tao concealing void, indicating how many great Daos existed within it. However, this didn't mean that all the great Tao fragments within the Tao concealing void had completely fused into so many great Daos. In fact, it had always been like this. In the Tao concealing void, the great Tao fragments that had originally been poured into it had maintained their original appearance all these years. Therefore, after the Tao concealing void exploded, the numerous great Tao fragments appeared in front of them like smoke. They surged slightly, as if they weren't calm at all. Every single one of these fragments of the Great Path was so mysterious, so profound, and so incredible. The strands of profound light that emanated from within it and the boundless strange sounds that were produced from within it were all thinking of the universe, and they were revealing the mysteries of the universe to all the worlds in the universe. These great Tao fragments themselves had the characteristics of fusing into a complete great Tao. At this moment, so many fragments of the great Tao had appeared here, but they began to naturally heal and merge together. However, it was a pity that these great Tao fragments naturally fused, but they wouldn't agree to the request of a false saint. This was because although the great Tao fragments would fuse together, they weren't limitless and endless. Generally speaking, the fusion of great Tao fragments that were equivalent to more than 10 great Tao fragments into a complete great Tao was already the limit of the fusion of the great Tao fragments. It was difficult for the great Tao fragments that exceeded this limit to fuse together. Instead, they fused separately according to this unit. In other words, if the numerous great Tao fragments in front of Luo Fan were to naturally fuse together, they definitely wouldn't be able to fuse into a vast great Tao that met everyone's requirements. In the end, they would only fuse into more than 100 great Tao fragments, and each great Tao was equivalent to more than 10 great Tao that could give birth to a false saint. This was actually normal. If the fusion of all the fragments of the great Tao was limitless and limitless, then how could there still be so many worlds in the universe after billions of years? They should have formed the worlds that Han Guzi and the others wanted to open up and fuse together. This wasn't difficult to understand. No matter how small the probability was, when the base was magnified to an unbelievable number, it would become something inevitable. It was just like how the great Tao of many worlds naturally flowed and fused together. Of course, this was also an extremely small probability event. However, if the time was magnified to billions of years, it would obviously become inevitable. In other words, if there was no limit to the characteristics of the great Tao fragments fusing into one, there would be no limit and no end to the fusion between heaven and earth. In the end, after countless years, when the probability was magnified to an inevitable level, it would naturally stop when all the great Tao and heaven and earth in the universe were completely fused together. At this moment, this kind of thing didn't happen. It was enough to show that the fusion of these great Tao fragments not only had a limit in terms of the total amount, but there were also some specific requirements in terms of state. For example, the complete great Tao couldn't fuse with each other, or the incomplete ones had to be fused to a complete state. Regarding the various characteristics of the great Tao fragments, Luo Fan wasn't the only one who was clear about this. The other false saints didn't have any doubts either. At this moment, all of them were increasing their strength, and the aura of a true sage was faintly emitted from their bodies. This kind of true sage aura. Naturally, it wasn't their own aura. Instead, it was the aura that leaked out from the true sage mystical abilities that they were brewing in their bodies. This kind of aura, in essence, was the aura that they borrowed from the true sage. After the aura was emitted, the entire void was filled with a vast and mighty aura. Vaguely, it had formed into an extremely profound group of light figures, which had completely covered the entire void. Looking from afar, it looked as if there were countless worlds stacked on top of each other in this void. Under the stimulation of this aura, the fusion of the many great Tao fragments began to gradually slow down. Moreover, the boundary between the fusion also began to gradually break. The many great Tao fragments began to fuse with any other great Tao fragments. However, very quickly, they broke away from the fusion and began to fuse with other great Tao fragments. Just like that, it continued to rotate and change. Although the speed of the fusion of the great Tao fragments had gradually slowed down, it was only compared to its original speed. According to the absolute speed, however, it was still unimaginably fast. In just a few breaths of time, each great Tao fragment had already fused with billions of other great Tao fragments. and separated from the other great Tao fragments. However, this was still insignificant to all the great Tao fragments. It was almost as small as a grain of sand on a boundless beach. According to the number of great Tao fragments, when any great Tao fragment fused and separated with all the other great Tao fragments, it would take at least billions of times more time. In other words, it would take billions of breaths. 1 minute was about 20 breaths. 1 hour and 60 minutes was 1,200 breaths. In this way, it would be about 10 million breaths a year. According to this method, billions of breaths would obviously take hundreds of thousands of years. Hundreds of thousands of years was not a long time for many pseudo-sages. Any pseudo-sage had the experience of adjusting their breath and cultivating for a longer period of time than this. However, these false sages were obviously unwilling to wait here for hundreds of thousands of years for each great Tao fragment to fuse with each other once and complete the first step of completely combining all the great Tao fragments. Don't forget, at this moment, they still needed to prepare their true divine powers and summon their true qi to intimidate these great Tao fragments, so that these great Tao fragments would not fuse according to their own characteristics. This was not an easy task. Because they knew this clearly, many false sages were not in the mood to continue waiting here. They each activated their true sage mystical powers and emitted more and more powerful true sage aura from their bodies, causing the light shadows formed by the true sage aura to become more and more realistic, mysterious, and chaotic. In this change, the activity of the great Tao fragments increased again. The speed at which each great Tao fragment fused with the other great Tao fragments and separated suddenly accelerated. It was not just 10 times or 100 times, but thousands or even tens of thousands of times. At this speed, the time needed to complete the fusion of all the great Tao fragments into one and turn them into a complete great Tao had been reduced from the original hundreds of thousands of years to decades. Although such a period of time was still extremely long for ordinary people, it was nothing to the many false sages. They could not be dissatisfied with it at all. Therefore, at this moment, all the false sages had settled down. They began to wait for the final result. In the process of waiting, it was not that they did nothing, but they quietly comprehended the various mysteries of the great Tao and the countless great Tao fragments in front of them. One had to know that these were great Tao fragments of more than 1,200 complete great Tao. It was so rare that it could only appear once. If they wanted to see such a scene again, they would have to dig it out from their memories. And under such a rare situation, the various mysteries of the great Tao and the mysteries of the false sage level were revealed. However, they were all displayed in an extremely clear manner without any concealment. In the process of fusing and separating, the endless mysteries were constantly mutating, giving rise to all kinds of mysteries that might be the characteristics of true sages. This was even more beneficial to them. Because of these various reasons, how could they just watch the changes of the great Tao fragments in front of them without doing anything? While everyone was comprehending the mysteries of the great Tao in these great Tao fragments, Luo Fan did not stop. Instead, he released his own power and began to slowly construct a strange place in the void. It was a mysterious, and marvelous mystery. A complete great Tao could only be truly complete when it appeared in the netherworld. Only then could a true world be born from it. From this, it could be seen that although the netherworld was not as obvious as normal space-time and was not as important as the nomological layer, however, it was actually the most important place in the entire world other than the great Tao. If there was no netherworld, not to mention space-time, even the nomological layer could not be formed. That great Tao, it was still just a great Tao and would not become the great Tao of a certain world. It could be said that the netherworld was the home and the foundation of the great Tao. At this moment, the mission that Luo Fan was assigned to, it was to build this netherworld. Although there was nothing in the netherworld, it felt that it was very easy to build it. In fact, to build a netherworld, the difficulty was not even easier than opening up a world, be it the minor kiliacosm, medium kiliacosm, or major kiliacosm. It was the same. Even the netherworld of ordinary worlds was like this. What Luo Fan wanted to build was a netherworld that could support more than 1,200 great Daos that could give birth to false sages. The difficulty was countless times more difficult than building a major kiliacosm. Even though Luo Fan was already the strongest false sage present, he had no choice but to use his intelligence to the limit and use his entire heart to build every detail of the netherworld. At first, Luo Fan did not make this netherworld too big. Instead, he slowly built it on his palm. Since even a world could be reduced to the size of a palm, this kind of netherworld that had no concept of space-time was naturally not a problem. In order to build the netherworld, he naturally needed the help of great Tao fragments. Luo Fan stirred up the power of the heavenly cauldron of the divine court and carefully weave these powers with the mentality of cultivating true sage mystical abilities, allowing these powers to continuously produce all kinds of indescribable things. In the end, through an extremely mysterious process, it formed a netherworld that was similar to space-time. In this netherworld, it wasn't the target he wanted. It was just an ordinary netherworld. It was probably equivalent to the netherworld that could give birth to false sages. After this netherworld was formed on his palm, he let out a long breath. Although it did not take much energy to build this ordinary netherworld, it had an astonishing requirement for his fine control. If he was not careful, he might destroy this netherworld. If it was not for the fact that Luo Fan's control over true sage mystical abilities was so strong that he could restrain his power at will and was completely unaffected by the outside world, he might have to fail hundreds of times before he could successfully create it. There was no aura of the great Tao in this netherworld. It was the purest and most primitive netherworld. This netherworld had a huge space for modification and improvement. As Luo Fan looked at this netherworld, his heart skipped a beat. He raised his hand and grabbed at the air. The great Tao fragments that were surging endlessly in front of him and undergoing billions of changes at every moment separated into a long river that slowly flowed into the netherworld in his hand. He kept leaving his aura in the netherworld, causing it to change continuously. Its aura kept changing, and its size kept growing. However, he naturally could not leave these great Tao fragments in this netherworld. He wanted to leave his aura in it. After the river of grand Tao fragments started to transform and gradually lose its original appearance, the river of grand Tao fragments took a turn and exited from another direction. It once again converged into the boundless cluster of grand Tao fragments ahead, and it continued to participate in the process of fusing and dispersing the cluster of grand Tao fragments we're currently undergoing. The entire process of guiding the long river of great Tao fragments into the netherworld and leaving from another direction was endless. It felt like this netherworld was like a water pump that kept spurting water back, becoming a transfer point for the endless great Tao fragments as the great Tao fragments flowed. The changes in the netherworld became more and more obvious, and the changes also increased. The amount of energy that Luo Fan needed to compress it into the palm of his hand also became more and more. Time passed quickly, and in the blink of an eye, several years had passed. On this day, the last great Tao fragment finally left its changes in the netherworld on Luo Fan's palm. And in the netherworld, because of the flow of the last great Tao fragment, it was completely fixed. At this moment, at first glance, the netherworld seemed to be exactly the same as when it was first constructed, as if nothing had changed in the past few years. But only Luo Fan knew how huge the changes in the netherworld were. Not only was its size several million times larger than before, but it also carried the aura of the endless great Tao fragments in front of him. It seemed to have an inexplicable connection with the endless great Tao fragments. If it wasn't for Luo Fan's suppression, it would have already started to completely devour all the great Tao fragments. The relationship between the netherworld and the great Tao. It wasn't a relationship of simultaneous growth. In other words, it wasn't how much the great Tao increased, but how much the netherworld would increase. The relationship between the two. It was like an exponential relationship. how much the great Tao increased, and how much the netherworld would increase was countless times more than the growth of the great Tao. That was why this happened. Although the total number of great Tao fragments was only 1,200 times that of the heaven and earth that could give birth to false sages, to accommodate such a great Tao, this could only be done by increasing the netherworld by several million times. The netherworld in Luo Fan's hands had undergone such changes in the past few years, and the changes in the great Tao fragments in front of the many false sages were not small either. At this moment, every great Tao fragment had completely fused with any other great Tao fragment before dispersing. In other words, in the group of great Tao fragments in front of him, any great Tao fragment had the aura of any other great Tao fragment. The result of this change was that at this moment, even without the suppression of the true sage aura that Luo Fan and the rest emitted, the fusion between the great Tao fragments had already stopped. Instead, it maintained its previous state. Every great Tao fragment was still constantly trying to fuse with other great Tao fragments, but it wasn't fixed and formed a whole. As a result, the group of great Tao fragments in front of them looked like a huge and constantly surging strange cloud. The many false sages were clear about this at this moment. At this moment, they slowly put away the true sage mystique that they had been brewing for several years and slowly eliminated the true sage aura that had suppressed the entire place. The various strange lights and shadows that had appeared in this area for several years gradually disappeared. Looking at the cloud in front of him, Luo Fan casually threw the netherworld that he had spent a huge amount of energy to suppress in his palm. The netherworld quickly shot towards the cloud. In the blink of an eye, it had already rushed into the cloud without holding back. After losing Luo Fan's suppression, the netherworld no longer suppressed its connection with the great Tao fragments. It began to devour the great Tao fragments crazily, swallowing the great Tao fragments that formed the cloud without holding back. Moreover, in the process of devouring the great Tao fragments, the netherworld began to gradually enlarge. In the blink of an eye, it had already enlarged from its original size on Luo Fan's palm to a size that was hundreds of times larger than the world beside it.